Good evening, gentle listener. I am Master Aldworth. Tonight I shall speak of comfrey root, a plant most ancient, most revered, most misunderstood perhaps in our modern age. I have been thinking about comfrey lately. It grows in the small garden behind this shop. I see it every morning when I go out to tend the plants. Tall stalks as high as my waist, rough, hairy leaves that are slightly prickly to the touch, purple flowers hanging in clusters, bell-shaped, drooping. The bees love those flowers. In the summer months, the comfrey patch is always busy with bees. Their humming fills the air. If you find comfort in this shop and wish to return for more forgotten remedies, do leave a mark of your favor, a like, upon this ledger, and subscribe to our gathering so that you may always find your way back to the apothecary's door when the next lesson is ready. Pour yourself a warming draught if you wish. Settle into your chair. Draw a blanket over your knees if the night is chill. There is no hurry in these matters. No hurry at all. The plant has waited centuries to tell its story. It can wait a few moments more while you settle yourself. And I, an old man now, have all the time remaining to share what I know. What I've learned over decades of practice. What I've read in old books. Outside, I can hear the occasional footstep on the cobblestones, someone walking home late, a night watchman on his rounds perhaps. But here inside, there is only stillness, the tick of the clock on the wall, the settling of the building's old timbers, and the smells, always the smells in an apothecary shop. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, tinctures in their bottles, beeswax and oil and old wood. My master, when I was an apprentice, knew comfrey well. He taught me how to dig the roots, how to clean them properly, how to prepare them in various ways. That was many years ago now. He's been dead these 30 years. But I remember his lessons. I remember his hands, gnarled with age, showing me how to pound the root in the mortar, the sound of the pestle striking, the gradual breakdown of the tough root fibers, the way the mucilage began to appear, making everything sticky. Let us begin, as we must, with names. For names carry meaning. You see, names carry history, pressed between their syllables like flowers in an old book. I have always found names fascinating. The way they accumulate over time, the way different people in different places call the same thing by different words. Each name tells us something about how people understood the plant, what they noticed about it, what they used it for. Comfrey. The very word rolls gently off the tongue, comfrey. Say it slowly, comfrey. There is something soft about the sound. Something soothing. It comes from the Latin, as so many of our learner words do, though the path from Latin to English was not direct. It wandered through French. Confirmer. The scholars say, growing together, the prefix sevid contrum, meaning with or together. Firma, meaning firm, strong, united, or perhaps savage confervere, to boil together, to fuse by heat. Another image of joining. Both meanings speak to the plant's ancient reputation. For comfrey was believed, you understand, to knit things back together, to bind what was broken, to heal what was torn, to unite what had been separated. If you broke a bone, comfrey would knit it. If you tore your flesh, comfrey would seal it. If you ruptured something internal, comfrey would mend it. This was the belief. This was the hope that people carried to the apothecary's door, or to the wise woman's cottage, or to the monastery infirmary. The botanists, with their careful classifications and their love of order, call it Symphytum officinale. Let me say that again. Slowly, Symphytum officinale. Symphytum officinale. The words have weight, they have authority. Latin names can seem cold, impersonal, but they serve a purpose. They tell us things the common names do not. Symphytum, this comes from the Greek word phynthio. It means to unite, to grow together, to cause to unite. The ancient Greeks, those remarkable people who gave us so much of our philosophical and medical tradition, they understood this plant's nature. They saw what it did. They gave it a name that captured its essence, Symphytum. The uniter, the bringer together, And that Greek name persisted through the Roman period, through the Middle Ages, into our modern Latin classification system. When Linnaeus, that great Swedish botanist, organized the plant kingdom in the 18th century, he kept that ancient Greek root. He recognized that it was fitting, that it captured something true about the plant. Names matter, you see. They shape how we think about things. A plant called the Uniter is already understood as healing, as binding, as helpful. And then there is sign officinale. This second part of the Latin name matters greatly. It matters perhaps even more than the first officinale means that the plant was recognized as official, as proper, as belonging to the officina. The officina, you see, was the workshop of the apothecary, the room behind the shop where medicines were prepared, where herbs were mixed and ground and combined. It was a sacred space, in its way, a place of transformation, where plants became remedies, where nature became medicine. To bear the name officinale was to be recognized, to stand among the great healing plants, to have a place in the official pharmacopoeia. Not every plant received this designation, only those with proven worth, with long histories of use, with established reputations. Valerian officinale for sleep and calm, dandelion officinale for the liver and digestion, Comfrey officinale. For wounds and bones, these were the foundational plants, the ones every apothecary must stock, the ones every healer must know. When a physician wrote a prescription calling for Symphytum officinale, the apothecary knew exactly what was meant, not some other species of comfrey, of which there are several, not a substitute, but this specific plant, with its specific properties. The Latin name ensured clarity, ensured that everyone from Rome to Paris to London to Stockholm was speaking of the same thing. But the common folk, the village healers, the goodwives in their cottages, they had simpler names, names that spoke more plainly of what the plant could do. These names varied by region, by dialect, but certain ones were widespread enough to be nearly universal in England. Knitbone, the most common of the folk names. Knitbone, say it slowly, knitbone. The two words pressed together, knit, as in weaving, as in joining threads into fabric. Bone, as in the hard skeleton that holds us upright, knitbone, for bones that were broken, shattered perhaps in a fall or a fight, or the hard, dangerous work of the fields. A man falls from a ladder while thatching a roof, his leg snaps, the bone breaks clean through, you can see it. Sometimes the white bone pushing against the skin, or even breaking through. A terrible injury in many cases, a death sentence, the bone would be set wrong or not at all. Infection would set in, the man would die in agony. But sometimes if the bone setter was skilled, if the patient was lucky, if comfrey was applied faithfully, the bone would heal, would knit back together, would bear weight again. The man would walk again, though perhaps with a limp. And people remembered. They remembered that comfrey helped, that it deserved to be called knitbone. Bone set, another name with the same meaning but arranged differently. Bone set, to set a bone means to align it properly, to put the broken ends back in their correct positions so they can heal. This was skilled work. The bone setter, often a specialized healer, would feel the break carefully, would pull and manipulate the limb. The patient would be given something for pain, strong ale perhaps, or poppy syrup if it was available, or nothing at all, and they would simply have to endure. The bone would be pulled until the ends are lined, then it would be held in place, splintered with sticks and bound with cloth, and comfrey would be applied. Bone set, the plant that aided in this terrible necessary work, that supported the bone setter's skill with its own virtue. Bruisort, a third common name for bruises, those dark flowers that bloom beneath the skin after injury. A bruise occurs when small blood vessels break. The blood leaks into the surrounding tissue. It shows as purple, then blue, then green, then yellow as it heals. Bruises hurt. They ache. They are tender to the touch. And in a time before painkillers, anything that eased a bruise was valuable. Comfrey, mashed fresh and applied as a poultice, was said to help bruises heal faster, to ease the pain, to draw out the blood that had pooled beneath the skin. Bruisort, the wort part is Old English for plant. Many medicinal plants bear this suffix, woundwort, lungwort. It marks them as plants of medicine, plants with purpose and use. Symphytum, another name, less common than the others, but still used by some closer to the Latin learning, to the Greek root. This was a name used by people who straddled both worlds. The scholarly and the practical monks, perhaps, who read Greek and Latin, but also worked in the herb garden, or learned apothecaries who knew the official names, but also spoke with their customers in common English. Symphytum. It sounds almost like a person's name, like someone you might meet on the road. These names mattered, you see. They carried hope, they carried the accumulated experience of generations who had used this plant and found it good. When a mother sent her son to gather knitbone from the hedgerow, she knew what she was asking for. The name itself was a kind of instruction. Find the plant with the rough leaves and the purple flowers, the one that grows along the ditch, the one called knitbone. Bring back its root, and the son would know, because he had been taught, because the name was part of the common knowledge of his community. This common knowledge is something we have largely lost. Most people today do not know their local medicinal plants, cannot identify them, do not know what they are called or how they are used. We have gained much in our modern age, but we have lost this intimate familiarity with the plant world, the sense that plants are not just decoration, but resources, partners, helpers. Let me pause here and describe the root itself, for it is a curious thing to behold, and understanding its physical nature helps us understand why people used it as they did. If you were to go out into the garden and dig up a comfrey plant, you would need a good spade. The roots go deep, very deep, sometimes 6 feet or more, down into the subsoil, where other plants cannot reach, seeking water and minerals. This deep rooting made comfrey hard to eradicate once established. If you cut it down, it would grow back from the root. You had to dig deep to remove it entirely. But for medicinal purposes, you need not dig that deep. The upper portion of the root is sufficient, perhaps a foot or two down. When you first pull the root from the earth, it is covered in soil, dark, damp earth clinging to it. You must wash it clean before you can see its true nature. The root is thick, finger thick in a young plant, as thick as your wrist in an old established plant, substantial, heavy. In color, it is black-brown on the outside. The bark, if we can call it that, is dark, rough, not smooth, like some roots. There is texture to it. But cut into that root, take a sharp knife and slice it clean, and you discover something quite different within. The interior is white, pale as milk, pale as fresh parchment, a startling contrast to the dark exterior. And it is sticky, slimy, even though I mean no disrespect by that word. When you cut the root, a clear, viscous substance oozes from the cut surface. Touch it with your finger. It is slippery, it coats your skin. If you rub your fingers together, you can feel how it lubricates. This is the mucilage, the substance that gives comfrey many of its medicinal properties. The texture is unmistakable once you have experienced it. Mucilaginous, that is the proper term. Full of mucilage, from the Latin fin mucilego, meaning musty juice or mold. Not the most appealing etymology, perhaps, but accurate. The substance is somewhat like the slime of a snail or the white of an egg, viscous, slippery, coating. This quality, this mucilaginous nature, was not lost on the old healers. They understood that the plant was showing them something important. If the root was slimy, sticky, binding to the touch, then surely it would bind wounds. Surely it would seal torn flesh. Surely it would hold things together. This was the doctrine of signatures, you see. An old theory that God, or nature, or providence, marked each plant with a sign of its purpose. A plant with heart-shaped leaves might be good for the heart. A plant with yellow sap might treat jaundice, which yellows the skin. And a plant with sticky, binding mucilage might bind and unite torn tissues. Modern science does not put much stock in the doctrine of signatures. It seems like magical thinking, wishful pattern making, but sometimes the old theory happened to be right, and with Comfrey it was at least partly right. The mucilage does have protective, soothing properties. The Comfrey root showed its binding nature in its very substance, and so it was used to bind. This logic made sense to people. It was compelling. I have held many such roots in my hands over the years, fresh dug from the garden behind this shop, the earth still clinging to them. The smell of soil and plant mixed together. The smell is subtle, earthy, clean. Some people say it is slightly mushroom-like, that earthy, fungal scent, not unpleasant, rather wholesome, I should say. There is nothing sharp about it, nothing acrid or burning. It is a mild smell. A gentle smell, appropriate for a gentle plant. When you wash the roots clean under cool water, scrubbing away all the soil, they become almost beautiful in a strange way, pale and smooth and odd, like something that should not see the light of day, something that belongs underground, in darkness, and yet you have brought it up. You have claimed it for medicine, for human purposes. There is something about this moment I have always found moving. The transition from earth to pharmacy, from wild thing to medicine. But I am getting ahead of myself, as old men often do. Our minds wander. We pursue one thought. Then another presents itself and seems more interesting. Let us return to structure. Let us return to the ancients, to the very beginning of Comfrey's long story. For this plant was old when Rome was young, old when Athens was at its height, old in human memory and human use. The Mediterranean world, picture it, if you will, the landscape of ancient learning. Dry hills covered in scrub, olive trees with their silver green leaves, the deep blue sea stretching to the horizon, white buildings under brilliant sun. This is where Western medicine was born, where observation and reason began to replace pure superstition, where plants were studied systematically. Segment 2, the ancient world picture, if you will, the Mediterranean world of long ago. Close your eyes and imagine it. Let the image form slowly in your mind. The sun is bright, painfully bright. The kind of light that makes you squint, even with your eyes closed. The kind of light that bleaches color from everything. White stone buildings, marble temples. The Parthenon on its hill, newly built, gleaming, or perhaps already ancient, depending on when in history we place ourselves. The air is warm, dry. It carries scents, cypress trees, pine, the salt smell of the sea, sometimes smoke from sacrificial fires, and sounds, the babble of the agora, the marketplace. Voices arguing, bargaining, discussing, the ring of metal on metal from a workshop, the creak of cart wheels on stone roads. This was a world without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without anesthesia, without surgery as we know it. And yet it was not a world without medicine. Far from it. The Greeks and Romans had sophisticated medical theories, careful observations, effective treatments for many conditions. In this world, Greek physicians were already using Comfrey root, already understanding its virtues, already incorporating it into their practice. This was 400 years before the birth of our Lord, 400 years before. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. 400 years is approximately 16 generations. Think of that. 16 lifetimes laid end to end. Your great, 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 great grandmother. That is 16 generations. And even she would have known Comfrey, would have known its uses. The Greek physicians used Comfrey root for heavy bleeding, for when a man was wounded in battle, struck by a sword or spear, and blood poured from the wound. Battle wounds were common in that age. City-states fought each other constantly. Hoplites, in their bronze armor, clashing with shields and spears. Men came home wounded, or they did not come home at all, or they were brought to physicians in the immediate aftermath of battle. needing urgent care. A physician would examine the wound, would clean it with wine, which they knew had some antiseptic properties, though they did not understand why. Then he would prepare comfrey, would pound the root, would apply it to the wound as a poultice, would bind it in place, and he would hope that the bleeding would stop, that infection would not set in, that the soldier would live to fight again. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not, but it was the best they had. The Greeks also used comfrey for bronchial problems, for coughs, for difficult breathing. Respiratory diseases were common. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, though they did not call it that. Chronic bronchitis from breathing smoke in poorly ventilated houses. A patient would come to the physician short of breath, coughing constantly, perhaps bringing up blood or thick phlegm. The physician would prepare comfrey root, would boil it into a decoction, would instruct the patient to drink it several times daily. Again, sometimes it helped, sometimes it did not. But the practice persisted, because often enough it seemed to make a difference. And they used it for wounds of all kinds: cuts, gashes, injuries from accidents, from falls, from the thousand dangers of daily life in an era without safety regulations. A man working in a quarry has a rock fall on his hand. The flesh is torn open. The bones may be broken. He needs help quickly, or he may lose the hand entirely. Comfrey would be applied, its binding, sealing properties relied upon, its reputation invoked. Now, let me tell you about some of the men who wrote about comfrey, the physicians and natural philosophers who documented its uses, who passed the knowledge down to us. First among them, perhaps, is Dioscorides. Pedanius Dioscorides, a Greek physician who lived in the 1st century of our current era. He served as a physician in the Roman army. He traveled widely. He saw many plants, observed many treatments, and he wrote a book, the most important medical botany book of the ancient world, Quid Materia Medica, concerning medical materials. This book described hundreds of medicinal plants. For each one, Dioscorides gave the name, the appearance, the habitat, and most importantly, the medical uses. It was systematic, it was careful, it was based on observation and experience, and it was enormously influential. For over 1,500 years, physicians consulted Dioscorides, copied his text, illustrated it, translated it into various languages. Every educated physician in Europe for over a millennium knew Dioscorides, learned from him, built upon his foundation. What did Dioscorides say about comfrey? Let me recall his words as best I can. I have read the text many times in Latin translation. He described the root carefully, black on the outside. He noted white and slimy within, just as we have described it ourselves already. 1,600 years ago, the observation was the same. The plant has not changed. The root has the same properties it had in ancient Rome. There is something reassuring about this continuity, this unchanging nature of the plant world, even as empires rise and fall. Dioscorides recommended comfrey root for those who were spitting blood, hemoptysis. We would call it today blood in the sputum. This was a terrible symptom, often a sign of consumption tuberculosis, a wasting disease that killed slowly, painfully, or it might indicate a bleeding ulcer in the stomach, blood making its way up and being coughed out, or lung damage from some injury or disease. Whatever the cause, the treatment was the same. Give comfrey root, let it seal the bleeding vessels, let it bind what was broken. Dioscorides also wrote of using the root as a compress, external application. The root would be pounded, or perhaps boiled into a strong decoction. Then cloths would be soaked in this liquid, or the pounded root itself would be spread on cloth. These cloths would be applied to fresh wounds, to close them, to seal them against air and dirt and corruption. The mucilage would coat the wound, would form a protective layer, would keep everything clean while healing occurred underneath. He mentioned using it for inflamed tissues around the anus, for hemorrhoids, for fissures. These are uncomfortable conditions, painful conditions, embarrassing perhaps. Though a physician sees everything and learns not to judge, the soothing mucilage would ease the irritation, would protect the inflamed tissue, would allow it to heal without constant friction. Dioscorides' descriptions are brief by modern standards, a few sentences per plant, usually no more. But those few sentences distilled the accumulated knowledge of generations, Centuries of observation compressed into concise instructions, and those instructions were trusted, were followed, were passed down for 1,500 years. Physicians read Dioscorides and believed him. Another ancient authority was Pliny the Elder, Gaius Plinius Secundus, a Roman, not a Greek, an encyclopedist rather than a physician. Pliny was curious about everything. He wrote a massive work called Fide Naturalis Historia, Natural History, 37 volumes covering all aspects of the natural world. Plants, animals, minerals, geography, ethnography, everything he could learn about, he wrote about. He was not always accurate. He repeated stories and folklore alongside actual observations. He was credulous sometimes, but he preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. And he wrote about comfrey. Pliny wrote that if you boiled comfrey roots, they produced a sticky mass, a glue, almost a substance that could hold things together. He claimed that this glue could literally hold pieces of meat together, bind them so firmly that they would not separate. Now, imagine what this meant to an ancient physician trying to understand how medicines worked. If the root could glue meat, could it not glue flesh? If pieces of butchered meat could be stuck back together with comfrey, could not torn human tissues be similarly reunited? The logic seems strange to us now, perhaps. We know that chemical adhesives are different from biological healing, that gluing meat together is not the same as healing a wound. But to Pliny, to other ancient writers, this seemed like compelling evidence. It was a physical demonstration of a spiritual or medical principle. Comfrey had the power to unite. Here was proof, visible and tangible. Pliny also mentioned using comfrey root for bruises and sprains, for the injuries of daily life, the twisted ankle, the wrenched shoulder, the deep bruise from a fall. These injuries were common in a world of physical labor, of walking long distances on rough roads, of carrying heavy loads, of accidents. A farmer would sprain his ankle, stepping wrong in a plowed field. A laborer would wrench his back lifting stones. A soldier would be bruised by a shield blow. Comfrey was the remedy, pounded fresh and applied, or boiled and used as a compress. Pliny noted comfrey as an emmenagogue in some preparations. An emmenagogue is a substance that brings on menstruation. In ancient medicine, blocked or delayed menses were considered dangerous potentially, causing all sorts of health problems. So substances that could bring on the monthly flow were valued. Comfrey was sometimes used for this purpose, though it was not the primary indication, likely mixed with wine and strong herbs taken internally, which we now know carries risks, but this was not understood then. Pliny died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. In the year 79 AD, he was on the Bay of Naples when the mountain exploded. He went to observe the phenomenon and to help with rescues. He was overcome by fumes and heat, died there on the beach. His curiosity and his compassion both contributing to his end. But his books survived, were copied and preserved, and through them, knowledge of plants like comfrey was maintained. Another name from antiquity is Galen, Clodius Galen, perhaps the most influential physician of the ancient world. Galen was Greek, but practiced in Rome. He served as physician to several Roman emperors. He performed public dissections and demonstrations, and he wrote prolifically. Volumes and volumes on medicine, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology. His theories dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years. Until the Renaissance, physicians were essentially Galenists. They believed what Galen taught. Galen mentioned comfrey. He noted its use for stopping bleeding, for knitting injuries, the same themes we have seen in other writers. His authority gave additional weight to comfrey's reputation. If Galen approved of it, then it must be sound. And so comfrey's place in medicine was secured. Dioscorides described it. Pliny demonstrated it. Galen approved it. 3 pillars of ancient authority, 3 voices in agreement. How could anyone doubt? There were other mentions as well. Scattered references in other texts, Greek writers whose names are less familiar to us now. Nicander wrote of comfrey in relation to poisons. whether as an antidote or simply as a remedy for the bleeding that poison might cause. The texts are not entirely clear, but the association was there. Comfrey as a protector, a defender of the body against harm. When multiple ancient authorities agreed on a plant's virtues, that agreement carried tremendous weight in an age without controlled trials. Without statistical analysis, authority and tradition were the guides. If the ancients said Comfrey worked, then it worked. That was enough for most practitioners. And so the knowledge became established, became part of the foundation, became something that did not need to be questioned or proven anew. The ancient world, for all its sophistication, was still a world of limited medical options. There was no effective treatment for infections, no anesthesia for surgery beyond strong drink or drugs that might kill as easily as they numbed, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no way to look inside the body without cutting it open, which was usually fatal. Given these limitations, anything that helped even a little was precious. And Comfrey, whether through its mucilage, or through promoting actual healing, or simply through making patients feel cared for, it helped. Let us pause here for a moment. Let the ancient world settle in our minds. The physicians in their robes, the patients suffering, the remedies prepared with care and hope. And let us consider how knowledge survived, how it moved from one generation to the next. In the ancient world, books were rare, expensive, hand-copied on papyrus or parchment. A single copy of Dioscorides might take months to produce. Most physicians probably did not own copies of the major texts. They learned from teachers, from apprenticeship, from oral tradition, supplemented by occasional access to texts. A young physician in training would memorize what his master taught him, would copy out important passages if he had the skill and materials. He would absorb the tradition through practice. And then Rome fell. The Western Empire collapsed. Barbarian sacked cities, trade routes broke down, the infrastructure of learning was damaged. Many books were lost, many centers of learning were destroyed. The lights went out across Europe, in some regions at least, but not entirely, not everywhere. Knowledge retreated, but it did not disappear. It retreated to monasteries, to those fortified. Self-sufficient communities where monks lived according to strict rules. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved texts, maintained libraries, maintained, crucially, gardens. The physic garden, where medicinal plants were grown, where the practical knowledge of healing was maintained alongside the theoretical knowledge in books. And Comfrey was there, growing quietly in monastery gardens, waiting to be needed. I sometimes think of those monks in their quiet cells, copying out Dioscorides by candlelight, their fingers cold despite the woolen gloves with cut-off tips. The scratch of the pen, the careful formation of letters, the concentration required to copy accurately, without error. They were preserving a world, the ancient world, the world of learning that might otherwise have been lost entirely. And in the garden outside, Comfrey was growing, sending up its tall stalks, each spring flowering, being harvested, being used. The book knowledge and the practical knowledge, existing side by side, each supporting the other. Let us rest here. Let the image form the monastery in its quiet valley, the garden with its orderly beds. The Mediterranean sun gives way to the softer, grayer light of northern Europe, to mist and rain and monastery bells ringing the hours. We move forward in time, into the Middle Ages proper, into the centuries that followed the fall of Rome. Segment 3, Monasteries, Missouri, in case, and medieval practice, the medieval period. The Middle Ages, a time often called dark, though perhaps that is unfair. Perhaps it is simply a different kind of light, not the brilliant Mediterranean sun of antiquity, but softer illumination, candlelight, firelight. The pale northern sun filtering through clouds, a quieter world in some ways, a more violent world in others, a world of faith and fear, of certainty and superstition existing side by side. Picture a monastery. Let the image build slowly in your mind. Take your time with it. Stone walls, thick walls, built to last centuries, grey stone or sometimes golden limestone. If the monastery was wealthy or fortunate in its location, the walls are cold to the touch. Even in summer, there is a chill to them. They hold the colder winter deep in their substance. A cloister, an open courtyard surrounded by covered walkways. The walkways have arched openings looking onto the courtyard. In the center of the courtyard, perhaps a well or a fountain, if this is a prosperous monastery, or simply grass, kept short by the sheep that are brought in to graze. The monks walk here in contemplation, in silent meditation, their footsteps echoing on the stone paving. Bells mark the hours, ringing out across the valley, calling the monks to prayer, to matins in the deep night, to lauds at dawn, to the offices throughout the day. The bells become part of the landscape, part of the rhythm of life. Time measured not by clock, but by prayer. This is a world ordered by ritual, by repetition, by the liturgical calendar that turns through its yearly cycle. And beyond the cloister, beyond the church and the dormitory and the refectory, there is a garden, the physic garden, the garden of healing, where medicinal plants are grown with great care and attention. This garden is important, vitally important. The monastery serves the surrounding community, provides medical care, distributes remedies to the poor. And all of those remedies must come from somewhere, from this garden, carefully tended by monks who have learned the old knowledge. Comfrey would have a place there, almost certainly, for it was too valuable, too well established, too necessary to be neglected. A bed of comfrey plants, perhaps in a corner where the soil is rich and deep, where water collects after rain. The plants grow vigorously. Each spring they send up fresh growth. By midsummer they are tall, flowering, full of life. The monk responsible for the garden knows each plant, knows when to harvest, knows how to prepare what is harvested. The Cistercians, with their white robes and their austere rule, the Benedictines in black, following the rule of Saint Benedict. Both orders maintained such gardens. Both orders understood the importance of healing, of caring for the sick. Saint Benedict himself, writing his rule in the 6th century, emphasized care for the sick. Before all things and above all things, he wrote, care must be taken of the sick. This was a religious duty, a spiritual obligation. To heal was to serve Christ. To tend the suffering was to tend Christ himself. And so the monks took their medical duties seriously. They studied the old texts, the ones that had survived, Dioscorides, Galen, Pliny. They copied these texts, illuminated them with beautiful paintings of plants, added their own observations in the margins, and they grew the plants, tested them, used them, accumulated practical experience alongside textual knowledge. Comfrey they grew deliberately, they cultivated it. They propagated it by dividing the roots, planting pieces to establish new plants. They ensured its supply because they knew from experience and from reading that comfrey would be needed when war came, and war came often in those turbulent centuries. The monastery would be ready. Imagine a battle. 2 feudal lords disputing over land. Their armies meet in a field, knights on horseback, men at arms on foot, the clash of metal, the screams of horses, the shouting, the confusion, the terrible efficiency of edged weapons against human flesh. Men fall, are trampled, are cut down, blood soaks into the earth. And when the fighting ends, when one side flees or surrenders, the wounded remain. Some of these wounded would be brought to the monastery, laid out in the infirmary, tended by monks who had training in medicine. The monks would assess each man, would determine what could be done. Many wounds were beyond help. Those men would be made comfortable, given the last rites, left to die. But some wounds could be treated. Some men could be saved. And for these men, every remedy, every skill, every prayer mattered. A soldier with a sword cut to the arm. The wound is deep but clean. The bone is not broken. There is a chance. The monk washes the wound, uses wine or vinegar. The soldier gasps at the pain, grips the sides of the bed. Then the monk applies comfrey, a poultice made from fresh root, pounded in the mortar until it is a pulp. This pulp is spread on clean linen. The linen is laid over the wound. More linen is wrapped around it, binding it in place. The soldier is given something for pain, willow bark tea perhaps, or poppy if the monastery has it, or nothing if supplies are exhausted. He is told to rest, to keep the wound clean and dry, to come back if fever develops, if the wound becomes hot and red and swollen. And then the monk moves to the next patient. There are always more patients. War creates work for healers. Sometimes the wounds healed, the flesh knit back together, the soldier lived, returned to his lord, or went home, or entered the monastery as a lay brother. And the comfrey received credit. The bone set, the knit bone, had lived up to its name. Other times, infection set in, the wound festered, turned putrid, filled with pus. The smell became unbearable. The monk would try other remedies, would lance the wound to drain it, would apply honey or bread poultices, would pray. Sometimes the patient survived even this. Sometimes they did not. Medieval medicine had its limits, severe limits. But comfrey was one of the reliable tools, one of the remedies that seemed to help more often than not. Not a miracle cure, but a solid, dependable plant that did what it was supposed to do. The monks had inherited the knowledge of the ancients. They had read Dioscorides, Galen, Pliny, or at least they had read later works that drew on those sources, but they also developed their own practices, their own preparations, their own understanding based on experience, over decades and centuries of actually using these plants, of seeing what worked and what did not. Knowledge accumulated. Saxon Herbals, written in Old English before the Norman conquest of England in 1066, mentioned comfrey. These were practical texts, not theoretical treatises, not philosophical discussions, but instruction manuals for healers. They gave recipes, specific instructions. Do this, then this, then this. For this condition, use this remedy. One Saxon recipe called for heating comfrey leaves over embers, not burning them. You understand, just warming them until they softened and released their moisture. Then the warm leaves will be ground together with honey, that other ancient medicine. Honey that never spoils, honey that was worth its weight in silver. This mixture of heated comfrey and honey would be taken on an empty stomach, first thing in the morning, before eating anything else. It was given for internal bleeding, for ruptures, for hernias. The empty stomach mattered. This was deliberate. The medicine would be absorbed more readily, they believed, without food to interfere with it. The patient would take the mixture, would feel it coating their throat, their stomach, would wait, hoping for relief. Ruptures and hernias were common in a world of heavy physical labor, of lifting stones to build churches, of hauling water, of plowing with oxen. Men strained themselves, women too, bearing children, carrying heavy loads. A rupture might mean death if the intestines became trapped and strangulated, blood flow cut off, tissue dying, agony, or it might mean chronic pain and disability, a bulge that ached constantly, that made work difficult, that could not be truly fixed. So a remedy for such things was precious, was sought after, was remembered and passed down through generations. Whether comfrey truly helped with ruptures is doubtful by modern understanding. A hernia needs surgical repair, really, but in an age without safe surgery, any hope was better than none. The monks also prepared decoctions. This was perhaps the most common method of preparation. Simple, reliable, easy to teach. Let me describe the process in detail, as it would have been done in a monastery infirmary. First, the comfrey root must be obtained, either freshly dug from the garden or taken from dried stock stored in the herb room. If fresh, the root would be washed thoroughly. scrubbed under running water to remove all soil, then chopped on a clean board with a sharp knife. If dried, the root would be hard, tough. It would need to be chopped small or even pounded in a mortar to break it into usable pieces. Take the chopped root, place it in a pot, a clay pot usually, or sometimes bronze or copper in wealthier monasteries. Add water, the proportions matter. Perhaps 100 grams of root to half a liter of water, not precise measurements. You understand? A handful of root to a measure of water. Medieval medicine was not exact. It could not be. There were no scales fine enough, no standardized measures. But experienced healers developed a feel for it, knew by eye and by hand roughly how much to use. Place the pot on the fire, or suspend it over the fire on a hook. Bring the water to a boil. Watch it carefully. Water boils over easily if you are not attending to it. And wasted medicine is a sin in a monastery where resources are limited. When it reaches a boil, reduce the heat. Let it simmer gently. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. No more than that, usually. The water begins to change. It thickens slightly, becomes cloudy, takes on a yellowish or brownish tinge. You can see the mucilage being extracted. The water becomes viscous when you stir it with a wooden spoon. It has a different consistency than plain water. The smell changes too. That earthy comfrey scent becomes stronger, fills the room. Not unpleasant, medicinal, purposeful. After the appropriate time, remove the pot from the heat. Let it cool slightly. Then strain it through cloth. Clean linen is best, or sometimes wool, though linen strains more cleanly. Pour the decoction through the cloth, catching the liquid in another vessel. The spent root pieces are left behind in the cloth. These can be discarded, or sometimes added to the compost heap or fed to pigs, who will eat nearly anything. The liquid that passes through is the medicine. The decoction, slightly viscous, slightly colored, carrying the virtues of the root. This decoction could be used immediately, while still warm, or it could be stored for a few days in a cool place, though it would not keep long, 3 days, perhaps. After that, it might sour, might develop an off smell. Better to prepare it fresh, when possible, for external use. Cloths would be soaked in this warm decoction, clean linen strips, torn from old garments or sheets. The cloth would be wrung out slightly, so it was not dripping, but still thoroughly wet. Then it would be laid on the injury, a sprained ankle, a twisted knee, a deep bruise on the thigh where a man was kicked by a horse. The warm, wet cloth would be molded to the shape of the injury. More cloth would be wrapped around it to hold it in place. And the patient would be told to rest, to keep the compress on for at least an hour, longer if possible. The warmth itself was soothing. Heat increases blood flow, brings healing blood to damaged tissues. And the mucilage, soaking in from the cloth, would coat the skin, would seal it, would provide some protective effect. Whether this truly accelerated healing, or simply made patients more comfortable, while natural healing occurred, is difficult to say, but the practice was widespread, was trusted, was continued for centuries. Some preparations used wine instead of water. Wine was common in medieval medicine. It was safer than water in many cases. Water could be contaminated, could carry disease, but wine with its alcohol content was less likely to make people sick. And wine was thought to extract different properties from plants than water did. To be heating where water was cooling, to be strengthening. A comfrey root wine would be prepared by boiling the root in wine, red wine usually, then straining and perhaps sweetening with honey. This wine would be given for various bleeding conditions, for women's monthly bleeding that was too heavy, for blood in the stool which might indicate ulcers or other internal problems, for bloody urine from kidney stones or infection. A small cupful would be taken, once or twice daily, not enough to intoxicate, but enough to deliver the medicine. The patient would feel the warmth of the wine. The coating sensation of the mucilage would hope for relief. The monks were methodical in their record keeping. Not always, not everywhere, but many monasteries kept records. Books recording treatments given, patients seen, remedies that worked or failed. These records accumulated over decades. Over centuries, they formed a body of practical knowledge, brother infirmarian would consult the records from previous brother infirmarians, would learn from their successes and failures. This comfrey preparation worked well for Brother Ailes' broken rib. This one did not help Sister Edith's stomach ulcer. Make note, pass it on. The monastery was, in this sense, a center of empirical learning, of evidence-based practice, though they would not have used that term. They observed, they recorded, they adjusted their methods based on results. This was science, of a sort, crude science, unsystematic, but science nonetheless. When warfare came to the monastery gates, the knowledge mattered urgently. The monastery might be besieged, might be sacked, might be burned, or it might simply be in a region where armies were campaigning and armies created wounded, always relentlessly. The monks would treat anyone who came to them, friend or foe. This was their obligation, their vow of service to God through service to the suffering. Imagine a young soldier, barely more than a boy, 16 years old perhaps. He has taken a sword cut to the forearm. The wound is deep, gaping. He is frightened, in pain. He has seen his companions die today. He thinks he might die too. The monk takes him in, washes his wound, speaks soothingly, applies comfrey poultice, binds it carefully, tells the boy to rest, gives him bread and weak beer, tells him he will probably live. If fever does not set in, the boy sleeps exhausted, dreams of home, of his mother, of the farm where he grew up, far from this battlefield, this monastery, this terrible injury. And sometimes, often, even the wound heals, the flesh knits back together. The boy lives, he returns to his unit, or he deserts, or he decides to stay with the monks as a lay brother, having seen enough of war. Is it the comfrey? Is it the cleanliness of the monastery? Is it the care and rest and decent food? Is it simply youth and a strong constitution? Probably all of these things together. Healing is complex. Many factors contribute, but the comfrey received credit and its reputation grew. The monasteries were not the only places where comfrey was used. Village healers used it too. Wise women, often called, these were women who knew the plants, who gathered them at the right times, who prepared them according to old custom passed down from their mothers and grandmothers. And they might not have read Dioscorides, might not have known Latin at all, but they knew comfrey worked. They knew where it grew in the hedgerows and ditches, knew to dig the root in autumn when its power was strongest, knew to wash it clean and prepare it fresh. In a village, there might be a woman known for bone setting, for treating fractures. She would be called when someone fell from a ladder, or was kicked by a cow, or suffered any of the countless accidents of agricultural life. She would come to the house, would examine the injury carefully with skilled hands, would feel the break, determine if it could be set. If it could, she would proceed, would pull the limb straight, would align the bone ends as best she could while the patient screamed or fainted. Then she would splint it, bind it with sticks and cloth, and apply comfrey, sometimes mashed fresh and spread thick. The cold, wet pulp pressed against the skin, shocking at first. Then somehow soothing, sometimes as a poultice with the whole leaves, pounded slightly to release their juice, sometimes as a strong decoction, cloth soaked and wrapped, and sometimes in a very old method. The preparation would be left to dry slightly, to harden, to form a kind of natural cast. As the comfrey poultice dried over the course of hours or days, it would become firmer, would hold the limb more securely, not as firm as plaster, which came much later, but firmer than cloth alone, enough to help the bone stay in place while healing. The village healer would visit regularly, would check the injury, would change the comfrey if it became too dried or began to smell, would watch for signs of trouble, heat, redness, swelling, the black streaks of infection spreading up the limb. If these appeared, more drastic measures might be needed, might mean the limb would be lost, might mean death. But often, if the break was clean and properly set, healing would occur. The bone would knit, the knit bone would live up to its name, and the healer's reputation would be maintained. And knowledge of comfrey would be passed to the next generation. This was how knowledge survived in the medieval period. In monasteries, yes, in books, yes, but also in villages, in oral tradition, in practical demonstration. A mother showing her daughter which plants to gather, which to prepare, in which ways, what to use for what complaints. An experienced healer taking an apprentice, teaching by example, by correcting mistakes. This knowledge was precious, was survival, was community health in an age when physicians were rare and expensive. Let us rest here in this medieval world, in the quiet of the monastery, in the bustle of the village. Comfrey, growing in ordered beds and in wild hedgerows known, used trusted, part of the fabric of life. We have seen it in ancient texts and in monastery gardens. Now let us move forward to an age of printing, of wider literacy, of great herbals. Segment 4, the age of herbals. Paracelsus, Pennsylvania, Parkinson, and Culpeper come now to a different time, a different world. The 16th and 17th centuries, the Renaissance, they call this period, the rebirth, the flowering of learning and art and exploration. Europe was changing rapidly. The printing press had been invented in the mid-15th century. Books could now be produced in quantities that would have seemed miraculous to medieval scribes. A book that once took months to copy by hand could now be printed in weeks. Hundreds of copies, thousands eventually. Knowledge spread, ideas spread. A physician in London could read about a treatment used in Italy or Germany, could try it himself, could write about his results. Medicine was becoming more systematic, more international, more based on shared knowledge rather than isolated local traditions. And among the books that were printed, Herbals held a prominent place. Great thick volumes describing plants and their uses. These were expensive books, books for professionals or wealthy amateurs, not for common folk, but they represented a crystallization of knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of centuries compiled, organized, made accessible. These herbals were written by learned men, physicians, botanists, apothecaries like myself, though perhaps more learned than I claim to be. They drew on the ancient sources, yes, on Dioscorides and Galen and Pliny, whose works had been preserved and were now being printed, but they added their own observations as well, their own experiences, their own case notes, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of practice. One such man was Paracelsus. Let us begin with him, a controversial figure, a revolutionary in his way, born Philippus, Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus, von Hohenheim. Can you imagine introducing yourself with such a name? It rolls on and on. He was born in Switzerland in 1493, died in 1541, only 48 years old. But he packed much into those years. He shortened his name to Paracelsus, Paracelsus, beyond Celsus, or superior to Celsus. Aulus Cornelius Celsus was a Roman medical writer from the 1st century, a respected authority. For this Swiss physician to name himself beyond Celsus was a bold claim, an arrogant claim, some said. And Paracelsus was arrogant. He admitted as much. He knew he was brilliant and did not hide it. He challenged the old authorities, challenged Galen especially, challenged the theory of humors that had dominated medicine for over 1,000 years. He promoted his own theories. Theories about chemistry, about minerals, about the relationship between macrocosm and microcosm. He made enemies among the established physicians, was driven out of several cities, wandered from place to place, practicing, teaching, writing, but he also made discoveries, genuine contributions to medical knowledge, and he knew his plants. Paracelsus wrote about comfrey root for fractures, for broken bones, and he was quite emphatic in his views. Dogmatic, even the root alone, he insisted, was sufficient. Take comfrey root, pound it fresh, spread it on muslin cloth, wrap the broken limb with it. This alone would cure the fracture. The bone would knit, the patient would heal. Surgeons, he complained, added too many other substances. Complicated matters unnecessarily. The comfrey itself was enough. He was criticizing the common practice of using complex preparations, mixtures of many ingredients. The more components, the better, some believed, but Paracelsus favored simplicity. The virtue was in the plant itself, adding other things only obscured this virtue. Now, we might wonder about this certainty, this absolute faith in Comfrey's power. Bones do heal themselves, after all, if properly set and immobilized. The body has remarkable regenerative capacity. Was it the Comfrey that healed the bone? Or was it simply that keeping the limb wrapped and still allowed natural healing to occur? We cannot know for certain. Paracelsus did not conduct controlled experiments. He observed patients who received Comfrey and recovered, but he did not compare them systematically to patients who did not receive Comfrey, did not account for other variables. Still, his belief was genuine based on what he had seen in his practice, and his reputation gave weight to that belief. Paracelsus described the application in detail. Take the fresh root, clean it thoroughly, pound it in a mortar until it becomes a pulp. The pounding must be thorough. The root is tough, fibrous. It takes effort and time to break it down properly. But the effort is worthwhile. The pounding ruptures the cells, releases the mucilage, makes the remedy more effective. Spread this pulp on clean muslin cloth. Not too thick, not too thin, a layer perhaps half an inch deep. Apply the cloth to the fractured limb, mold it to the shape of the limb. Cover the area of the break and some distance on either side. Then wrap more cloth around it, hold it in place. Wrap firmly, but not so tightly that blood flow is restricted. The patient must keep the limb still, must rest, must not try to use the injured part. Over time, the Comfrey poultice will dry, will harden somewhat, will form that natural cast we have mentioned before. This hardening takes several hours. During that time, the patient might feel various sensations. Cooling, tightening, sometimes a gentle warmth as inflammation subsides. The poultice should be changed every day or two. Removed, the limb gently washed, fresh Comfrey applied. This would continue for weeks, however long the bone needed to heal. 6 weeks for a simple fracture, longer for more complex breaks. Paracelsus claimed success with this method, claimed that bones healed straight and strong. Whether his results were truly better than other methods of the time, we cannot verify, but his confidence inspired confidence in others, and confidence in medicine matters. The patient who believes they will heal is more likely to follow instructions, to rest as directed, to eat well, to hope. Let us move forward in time, from Paracelsus in the early 16th century to John Parkinson. In the early 17th, Parkinson was English, born around 1567, died in 1650. Living to the good age of 83, he was an apothecary, like myself, but also a botanist, a gardener. He served as apothecary to King James I. Parkinson wrote 2 major works, Paradisi and Sol Paradisus Terrestri in 1629, a play on his name Park in Sun's Earthly Paradise, a book about ornamental and food plants, and then Fu Theatrum Botanicum. In 1640, the Theatre of Plants. This was his great medical botany, his herbal. More than 1,700 pages it ran, a massive volume describing hundreds upon hundreds of plants, their appearances, their habitats. And most importantly, for our purposes, their uses. This book represented the accumulated knowledge of European herbalism up to that point, drawing on ancient sources, on medieval practices, on contemporary observations. It was comprehensive, systematic, a reference work meant to be consulted by physicians and apothecaries, heavy enough to serve as a weapon if need be. The joke among apothecaries was that Physic botanicum could cure a headache by knocking the patient unconscious. Parkinson devoted space to Comfrey. Several pages, he described it carefully, meticulously. He noted the black root, rough on the outside, the white, slimy interior, just as the ancients had described. Just as we observe today, he described the plant's appearance above ground, the tall stalks, the rough, hairy leaves, the drooping purple flowers, or sometimes white flowers, in certain varieties where it grew, in moist places along streams and ditches, in gardens where it was deliberately cultivated. But most of his discussion focused on uses, on what Comfrey could treat, and here he expanded greatly beyond the ancients. For ulcers, he wrote those slow-healing sores that plague the elderly and the sick, that appear on the legs especially, that refuse to close, venous ulcers, we would call them now, caused by poor circulation, blood pooling in the veins, skin breaking down. In Parkinson's time, these were common and troublesome. They could persist for years, could become infected, could smell terrible. Comfrey root decoction would be used as a wash. Boil the root, use the liquid to clean the ulcer, to irrigate it, to remove dead tissue and pus. Then a fresh comfrey poultice might be applied, covering the ulcer, change daily promoting the growth of healthy flesh. Parkinson noted that the mucilage seemed to encourage granulation, the formation of new tissue filling in from the bottom of the wound. Whether this truly worked better than other treatments, we cannot say, but it was the standard practice, the thing that was done. For hemorrhoids, Parkinson recommended comfrey, those painful swollen veins around the anus, sometimes protruding, often bleeding, a common complaint caused by straining, by constipation, by childbirth, by sitting too long on cold stone. The treatment would be a decoction or an ointment applied directly to the hemorrhoids, soothing the inflamed tissue, helping them shrink. The mucilage would ease the discomfort, would make defecation less painful, would reduce bleeding. For gangrene, Parkinson mentioned comfrey, that terrible condition where tissue dies, where flesh blackens and putrefies, usually the result of injury combined with poor circulation, a crushed limb, a wound that did not heal, tissue dying for lack of blood. Gangrene was often a death sentence. If the dead tissue was not removed, infection would spread, would poison the blood, would kill the patient. Sometimes amputation was the only option. Cut away the dead part before an infection spreads. A drastic, dangerous surgery. But Parkinson noted that in early gangrene, before the tissue was completely dead, comfrey might help, would be applied as a poultice, would be changed frequently, would be combined with prayers and hope. Sometimes, rarely, the tissue would recover. Blood flow would return, the blackness would recede, the patient would live with all their limbs intact. More often, it did not work, but it was worth trying. Parkinson also mentioned putrescent ulcers, ulcers that were rotting, that smelled foul, that refused to heal. These might be on the skin, or internal in the stomach, or intestines. Though how they diagnosed internal ulcers without modern imaging, I cannot imagine. The comfrey decoction would cleanse them, would wash away corruption, would promote healing. This was part of the old theory of wound healing. Remove the bad, encourage the good, keep everything clean. Parkinson, like the ancients, also mentioned internal uses, though he was more cautious here than some earlier writers. For spitting blood, for internal bleeding of various kinds, for women's complaints, the preparations would be syrups or decoctions taken internally, coating the stomach and intestines, sealing bleeding vessels. This was standard practice in his time, not yet seen as dangerous. The pyrrolizidine alkaloids had not been discovered. The liver toxicity was unknown. Reading Parkinson now, with our modern knowledge, there is a poignancy to these recommendations. He was trying to help, was passing on what he believed to be effective treatments, was serving his patients as best he knew. But some of what he recommended was harmful, not intentionally. He simply did not know. This is the tragedy of medicine in eras before scientific method, before controlled trials, before biochemical analysis, good intentions, careful observation, accumulated experience, but also inevitable errors, inevitable harm done while trying to heal. Let us rest here a moment. Let Parkinson's massive herbal rest closed on the desk. Let the dust settle. Now we come to perhaps the most famous English herbalist of all, Nicholas Culpeper. Culpeper was born in 1616, died young, only 38, in 1654. But in that short life, he made an enormous impact. He was a controversial figure, a radical, some would say a revolutionary. He studied at Cambridge but left without a degree. Set up practice as an apothecary in London. This was during the English Civil War, a time of immense upheaval. The old order was being challenged. The king was being challenged. The established church was being challenged, and Culpeper, in his own way, challenged the medical establishment. He had radical ideas. He believed medical knowledge should be available to common people, should not be locked away in Latin texts that only the educated could read. The physicians, the university-trained doctors, they guarded their knowledge jealously, wrote in Latin, kept their secrets. This ensured their prestige, their high fees, their monopoly on medical practice. Culpeper thought this was wrong, immoral. Even medicine should serve the people, should be accessible. So he did something shocking. He translated the physician's main reference work, the Phytopharmacopoeia Londinensis, into English. This was an official text listing medicines and how to prepare them, written in Latin, meant for professionals only. Culpeper translated it, published it, made it available to anyone who could read English. The physicians were furious. They attacked him, called him a charlatan, accused him of giving away secrets that lay people could misuse. But Culpeper did not stop. He went further. He wrote his own herbal, in English in plain, direct language, organized in a way that was easy to use. The English physician, he called it initially, later known as ducal pepper, as herbal, published in 1652, and it was enormously popular, went through edition. Common people bought it, read it, used it. It became one of the most widely owned books in England, second only to the Bible in many households. Why was it so popular? Because Culpeper wrote for ordinary people in language they could understand. He was practical, direct, sometimes crude by polite standards. He did not mince words. And he included everything, not just elite, expensive medicines, but common plants, plants people could gather themselves, plants that grew in hedgerows and fields, self-sufficiency. Independence from expensive physicians, this appealed to people. What did Culpeper say about Comfrey? He said a great deal, and he said it in his characteristic style. He recommended comfrey root prepared as syrup or decoction for an astonishing range of complaints. Let me list them. For spitting and pissing blood, blunt language, but clear. Everyone knew what he meant. For inward wounds, injuries internal to the body. Bruising of organs, damage not visible from outside. For bloody flux. Dysentery, diarrhea with blood. A dangerous condition that killed many. For stopped menses in women, when the monthly courses did not come, this was considered dangerous, potentially fatal. For cut nerves and muscles, the kind of injury you might get from a farm accident, a scythe slipping, an axe biting wrong. For knotted breasts, meaning hard, painful lumps, possibly abscesses, possibly tumors, painful and frightening. For hemorrhoids, for gout, for painful joints, for gangrene. The list goes on and on. It seems there was hardly anything Comfrey could not treat, according to Culpeper. Now, we must be careful here. We must understand the context of this expansive list. In Culpeper's time, the range of effective medicines was limited, very limited compared to what we have today. Most diseases could not be cured. Most injuries could not be truly fixed. Medicine could provide comfort, could support natural healing, but could not work miracles. So a remedy that seemed to help multiple conditions was precious, was seized upon, was perhaps recommended more broadly than strictly warranted. If Comfrey helped some cases of spitting blood, then perhaps it would help all cases. If it eased one type of pain, perhaps it would ease all pain. This logical extension was natural, was understandable, was probably inevitable. But it led to overstatement, to promising more than could be delivered, to disappointment when remedies failed. Still, Culpeper was not being dishonest. He genuinely believed what he wrote based on his observations, his experience, the reports of others. Culpeper also wrote about applying comfrey root externally. This is where his advice is most sound, most aligned with modern understanding. Pound fresh comfrey root, he instructed, spread it on cloth, lay it on the affected part, for wounds, for bruises, for sprains, for all the injuries of daily life that common people encountered. This would help, would genuinely help. The mucilage would soothe, would protect, might indeed aid healing. Culpeper noted that the leaves could also be used though the root was generally considered more powerful. The root went deeper. People believed, both literally, growing deep in the earth, and figuratively, penetrating deep into the body's tissues. The root had more virtue, more strength, was worth the extra effort of digging and cleaning and preparing. Culpeper added something else to his discussions of plants. He included astrology. Each plant, he believed, was governed by a particular planet. Mars plants were hot and stimulating. Venus plants were gentle and soothing. Saturn plants were cold and binding. Comfrey was a Saturn plant, he said, cold and dry in quality, appropriate for hot, moist conditions. This seems strange to us now. We do not believe plants are governed by planets. We do not base medical treatment on astrological charts. But in Culpeper's time, astrology was taken seriously, was part of educated thought, was integrated into medicine. Knowing a plant's planetary ruler helped you understand when to gather it, when to administer it, what it would best treat. Saturn plants were gathered when Saturn was strong in the heavens, were given to patients whose conditions aligned with Saturn's nature. Whether this made any practical difference, we cannot say, but it shows how medicine was embedded in a whole worldview, a cosmology, a sense of interconnection between earth and sky. Culpeper's Herbal remained in print for centuries, was reprinted again and again, was carried to America, was used by generations of families, even today. You can buy editions of Culpeper's Herbal, modernized somewhat, but recognizably his work, his influence on popular herbalism cannot be overstated. He democratized knowledge, made it accessible, made it belong to the people. These three men, Paracelsus, Parkinson, Culpeper, represent the height of Comfrey's reputation in European herbal medicine. By the mid-17th century, every apothecary would have known Comfrey, would have stocked it, would have prepared it regularly. Every wise woman would have recognized it. Every farmer's wife would have known where it grew and how to use it. It was universal. It was trusted. It was part of the fabric of healing. Let me tell you how we prepared it in a shop much like this one, though that was long before my time. You understand? Before my master's time, before his master's time. But the methods were passed down, were taught, were preserved. The roots would be purchased from herb gatherers, people who went out into the countryside, who knew where Comfrey grew, who dug it at the proper season. These gatherers were specialists. They knew the plants, knew the best locations, knew the right times to harvest. They would bring their harvest to town, to the markets, to apothecary shops like this one. The apothecary would inspect the roots carefully, would make sure they were genuine Comfrey, not some other plant, would check for quality. The roots would arrive muddy, earth-covered. They would need to be cleaned before they could be sold or prepared. We would wash them under cool running water. If there was no running water, we would scrub them in a basin, changing the water several times, scrub them gently with a brush to remove all the soil, all the grit, until the dark brown surface was clean. Then they would be chopped or sliced, depending on the intended use. Some apothecaries dried them for storage, laid them out on screens in a warm, dry room. Let them desiccate slowly over days or weeks. Dried roots could be kept for months, even years, in a cool, dry place, stored in sacks or boxes, taken out as needed. When you wanted to use dried root, you would soak it in water, first to soften it, or pound it directly, though this required more effort. Others preferred to use fresh roots when possible. Fresh was considered more powerful, the virtue still alive in the plant. But fresh roots had to be used more quickly, within days, before they began to rot or mold. So it was a balance. Keep some dried for reliability. Use fresh when available for potency. To make a decoction, you would take chopped root, perhaps 100 grams, about a handful, place it in a pot with about half a liter of water, a pint in old measures, bring it to a boil over the fire, then reduce to a simmer. Let it cook for 10-15 minutes. No more, usually. The water would thicken, would become cloudy, would take on that characteristic, viscous quality. You could tell when it was ready by the consistency, by the smell, by experience. An experienced apothecary, you by instinct. did not need to measure time precisely, could judge by eye and nose and feel, strain it through cloth. The liquid would be slightly viscous, slippery to the touch, ready to use. This decoction could be used immediately while still warm. The warmth was part of the remedy, or it could be stored for a few days, though. It would not keep long, 3 days perhaps, in a cool place, covered to keep out dust and insects. After that it might sour, might develop an off smell. Better to prepare it fresh when possible. For external use, cloths would be soaked in it, clean linen strips, torn from old garments or sheets worn too thin for other use. Nothing was wasted in an apothecary shop. Old linen became bandages. Old bottles were reused. Every resource mattered. The cloth would be wrung out slightly so it was not dripping but still thoroughly wet. Then it would be laid on the injury. For a poultice, fresh root was best. Take the cleaned root, pound it to a pulp with a mortar and pestle. This required some effort. The root was tough, fibrous. A young apprentice might be set to this task, building arm strength while learning the trade. Pound, 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 the steady rhythm of the pestle, the gradual breakdown of the tough fibers. The result would be a wet, sticky mass. This would be spread on cloth, perhaps muslin or linen. The cloth would be laid on the injury and bound in place. It would be left for hours, sometimes overnight. The patient would be instructed to keep it moist, if possible, to wet it with more decoction periodically, or simply to leave it and let it dry. As the poultice dried, it would harden somewhat, would form a protective layer, would hold the injury still. For a fracture, this immobilization was helpful. For a wound, the coating might keep dirt and air away, reducing infection, at least. That was the theory, and often enough it seemed to work. Salves and ointments were also made. These required more preparation, more time, more skill. First, the root would be infused in oil, olive oil, usually sometimes other oils if olive was unavailable or too expensive. The chopped root would be covered with oil in a jar sealed, left for weeks, sometimes a month or more, or the process could be hastened by gentle heating. Put the jar in warm water, let it sit near the fire. Heat extraction pulled the virtues into the oil more quickly, but slow cold infusion was considered better by some, more complete. Then the oil would be strained. Pressed through cloth to extract every drop, the spent root discarded. The oil would now be greenish, viscous, carrying the properties of the comfrey. To make it into an ointment, beeswax would be added. Precious beeswax from the beekeeper. Melt the wax in a pan. Add the infused oil. Stir constantly while it melts together. The proportion mattered. Too much wax in the ointment would be too hard. Too little, and it would be too soft. About 1 part wax to 5 parts oil was typical, but this varied depending on the season. Harder in summer, when heat might soften it. Softer in winter, when cold would harden it. Pour the mixture into small pots while still liquid. Let it cool. It would solidify into a smooth salve. This comfrey salve would keep for months. It could be applied to injuries as needed, rubbed into sore joints, spread on wounds. Some apothecaries added other ingredients to their comfrey salves. This was common, combination remedies. Calendula for its soothing properties, plantain for drawing infection, St. John's wort for pain. Each plant contributing its virtue, working together, synergy. We might call it today. The belief was that plants worked better together than alone, that they enhanced each other, complemented each other. Whether this was true, or whether it simply gave practitioners more options to work with is hard to say, but the practice was widespread. Most salves and ointments contained multiple herbs. Comfrey was often the base, the primary ingredient, but rarely the only one. Looking back on this era, the age of the great herbals, we see comfrey at its zenith. It was respected, trusted, universally used. Every apothecary shop would have it. Every wise woman would know it. It appeared in every herbal, in every listing of useful plants. Its virtues were celebrated, its uses catalogued in detail. But its story was not yet complete. There were still more chapters to unfold, more uses to discover, more continents to reach. Let us rest here a moment in the quiet of the apothecary shop. the wooden shelves lined with jars and bottles, the smell of dried herbs hanging in bundles from the ceiling, the sense of continuity of tradition of knowledge passed down through generations. The shop is timeless in a way. This is how it has always been. This is how it will always be. Or so it seems in this quiet moment. Segment 5, Beyond Bones, the internal landscape. We have spoken much of wounds and broken bones, of external injuries, visible and tangible. Things you can see and touch. A gash in the skin, the bone bent at an unnatural angle. A bruise flowering, purple and blue beneath the surface. These are concrete, obvious. The injury is apparent. The treatment makes sense. But comfrey root was also used internally, taken into the body as tea, as syrup, as decoction. Swallowed, absorbed. This aspect of its use is more controversial now, more problematic, more fraught with modern concerns about safety. But historically, this internal use was very important, perhaps even more important than external use in some traditions. People believed that comfrey could heal from within, could seal bleeding vessels deep in the body, could knit torn internal tissues. The same logic that applied outside applied inside. If it bound wounds on the skin, surely it bound wounds in the stomach, in the lungs, in the womb. Let us begin with the lungs, those delicate, spongy organs that fill and empty with each breath we take. Expand, contract, every moment of our lives from birth to death. The lungs take in air, extract what is needed, expel what is not, a miraculous process we barely think about until something goes wrong. And in an age before antibiotics, lung diseases were common, terribly common, and often fatal, pneumonia. The lungs filling with fluid, drowning from within, fever, difficult breathing, death in days of severe tuberculosis, called consumption, a wasting disease. The lungs slowly destroyed, coughing, weight loss, blood in the sputum. Months or years of decline, bronchitis, chronic or acute, the airways inflamed, coughing fits that bent you double, left you gasping. And many of these conditions involved bleeding, blood mixed with the phlegm that was coughed up, or pure blood, sometimes bright red. Alarming, hemoptysis, the physicians called it, from Greek words meaning blood spitting, a clinical term for a terrifying symptom. When you coughed up blood, you knew something was seriously wrong. You feared consumption, feared a slow death, feared infecting your family. Comfrey root was given for such bleeding. It was one of the primary remedies, standard treatment, prepared as a strong decoction, boiled long to extract maximum virtue, or made into a syrup with honey for ease of swallowing. The patient would take it several times daily, morning, midday, evening before bed, religiously, faithfully, hoping the theory was the same as for external bleeding. Comfrey would seal the broken vessels, would bind them, would stop the hemorrhage. The mucilage would coat the lungs, would protect damaged tissue, would give it a chance to heal. At least that was the belief, that was the hope. Whether it truly helped, we cannot know with certainty. Some patients recovered, others did not. But in the absence of other effective treatments, in an era before antibiotics could cure lung infections, anything that offered hope was tried and tried again and passed down through generations as reliable treatment. Comfrey was also used for coughs themselves, apart from bleeding, simply for the cough, the harsh, racking coughs of bronchitis, the whooping cough that affected children especially, the painful coughs that came with pleurisy. Think about a severe cough. The spasms in your chest, the burning in your throat, the exhaustion of coughing repeatedly, the way it prevents sleep, prevents eating, prevents recovery. A cough can be debilitating all on its own. The mucilage in comfrey was soothing. This made sense to practitioners, made sense to patients. It would coat the throat, coat the airways, would ease the irritation that triggered coughing. Think of how honey soothes the sore throat, how it coats and comforts. The effect was similar, perhaps a protective coating. The patient would sip comfrey syrup slowly, let it slide down the throat, feel the coating sensation, the temporary relief. For whooping cough, that terrible disease of children, Comfrey was one of several remedies tried. Whooping cough, pertussis, causes violent coughing fits. The child coughs and coughs until they cannot breathe, then gasps in with a characteristic whoop sound. It was dangerous. Children died from it or were left weakened, vulnerable to other infections. Anything that might ease the coughing was precious. Comfrey syrup would be given, spoonfuls throughout the day and night. Did it help? Some children recovered, others did not. The disease ran its course regardless, perhaps. But parents wanted to do something, needed to do something, could not simply watch their child suffer without trying to help. For quinsy, an old name for severe throat infection with abscess, Comfrey was sometimes employed. Quinsy caused terrible throat pain, difficulty swallowing, sometimes difficulty breathing if the swelling was severe. It was dangerous. The abscess could rupture, choking the patient, or the infection could spread, causing sepsis. Comfrey tea or syrup would be gargled or swallowed. Hope to reduce the swelling, to ease the pain, sometimes combined with other treatments, lancing the abscess. Poultices applied externally to the neck. For pleurisy, inflammation of the membranes around the lungs, Comfrey was also used. Pleurisy causes sharp, stabbing pain with each breath, made worse by deep breathing or coughing. The patient would take shallow breaths to avoid the pain, but shallow breathing meant poor oxygenation, meant weakness, meant vulnerability to pneumonia. Comfrey was thought to reduce the inflammation, to soothe the inflamed tissues, to allow deeper, less painful breathing. Whether it worked through any direct anti-inflammatory action, or simply by coating and soothing, or not at all, we cannot say. Some old texts describe Comfrey root as useful for defective circulation in the lungs. This is vague language, but it might have referred to conditions where blood flow was impaired, where the lungs were not functioning properly. Perhaps what we would now call pulmonary embolism, or heart failure causing fluid backup into the lungs, or chronic lung disease. The practitioners did not have our modern understanding, did not know about blood clots or heart mechanics or oxygenation. But they observed symptoms: shortness of breath, cyanosis, the bluish tinge of poor oxygenation, weakness, fatigue. And they tried Comfrey, tried anything that might help. Moving down from the lungs, we come to the digestive tract. Another common site of Comfrey use: the stomach, the intestines, the complex system that processes food, extracts nutrients, eliminates waste. A system that could go wrong in many ways, and did go wrong frequently, in eras of uncertain food safety and poor sanitation. For ulcers of the stomach, those painful erosions in the stomach lining, that cause burning pain, that sometimes bleed. Peptic ulcers, we call them now. We know they are often caused by bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, or by certain medications that damage the stomach lining. But the old healers did not know this. They knew only that some people had terrible stomach pain, that the pain came in waves, that it might be relieved temporarily by eating, that some people vomited blood or passed black, tarry stools, blood digested as it passed through the intestines. This was frightening, potentially fatal. Internal bleeding that could not be directly seen or stanched, Comfrey root tea or syrup, was given. The standard treatment, taken on an empty stomach, usually first thing in the morning before eating. The idea was that the mucilage would coat the stomach, would protect the ulcerated area, would give it a chance to heal, and perhaps it did help. Modern research has found that mucilaginous herbs do provide some protective coating to mucous membranes. They create a physical barrier between stomach acid and damaged tissue. This might indeed promote healing. Whether Comfrey specifically was better than other mucilaginous plants, we cannot say. Marshmallow root also contains mucilage. Slippery elm bark, these might work equally well, or better even, since they lack the toxic alkaloids. But Comfrey had the reputation, had the long history, was the go-to remedy for stomach problems. For gastritis, inflammation of the stomach lining, Comfrey was also used. Same theory, same preparation. Gastritis causes nausea, pain, sometimes vomiting, loss of appetite. It can be acute or chronic, caused by many things. Excessive alcohol, certain medications, stress, infection. The comfrey would soothe, would coat, would give relief, at least temporarily. The patient would feel the mucilaginous liquid sliding down, feel it coating the stomach, feel some easing of the burning sensation. For diarrhea and dysentery, comfrey had an important place. These were serious conditions in the past, more serious than we often realize today. Diarrhea meant fluid loss, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, death, if severe and prolonged, especially in children and the elderly. Dysentery was worse, bloody diarrhea, caused by bacterial or parasitic infection, painful cramping fever, often fatal without treatment. In epidemics, dysentery could devastate communities, kill thousands. It was a disease of poor sanitation, of contaminated water. Comfrey, being astringent as well as mucilaginous, was thought to bind the bowels, to stop excessive flow. Astringent means it causes tissues to contract. To tighten, tannins are astringent. So is witch hazel. So, to some degree, is comfrey. This contraction might indeed slow diarrhea, might reduce the fluid loss, might give the body time to fight off infection. Combined with the mucilage coating the intestinal lining, protecting it from further irritation, comfrey might provide genuine relief. The patient would drink comfrey decoction frequently, as much as they could keep down, hoping to slow the relentless flow. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. Sometimes the disease was too severe, the infection too aggressive, but it was tried religiously. It was part of standard treatment for bowel complaints. Some texts mention comfrey for passive hemorrhages from the bowels, meaning bleeding that came without pain, without straining. This might have been from hemorrhoids, those swollen veins that can bleed, sometimes quite heavily, or from some internal condition, a polyp, perhaps, or inflammation, or ulceration of the intestinal wall. The patient would notice blood in the stool, bright red if from hemorrhoids or lower bowel, dark and tarry if from higher up, already digested. This was alarming, internal bleeding of unknown origin. No way to see what was wrong, no way to fix it directly. The patient would grow pale, would become weak, would be short of breath with exertion. Anemia from slow blood loss. Comfrey syrup would be given strong doses, regular doses. Hope to seal whatever was bleeding, hope to stop the drain of life. Sometimes it seemed to help, the bleeding would stop. The patient would gradually regain strength as their blood replenished itself. Other times it did not help. The bleeding continued, the patient declined, died eventually from the slow hemorrhage. For women's complaints, comfrey had its place as well. This use was less common than some others, less emphasized in the herbals. For excessive menstrual bleeding, menorrhagia, the medical term, periods that were too heavy, too long, that left women weak and anemic. This could have many causes: fibroids in the uterus, hormonal imbalances, blood clotting disorders. But the causes were unknown in the past. Only the symptom was known: too much bleeding, month after month, draining the woman's strength. Comfrey would be given to reduce the flow, to help the blood coagulate, to seal the vessels. Whether it helped is questionable. Menstrual bleeding is complex, controlled by hormones, not easily affected by herbs taken orally. But the treatment was tried. The women were desperate for relief, for anything that might help. For metrorrhagia, bleeding between periods, comfrey was also mentioned. This was considered especially dangerous. Normal monthly bleeding was expected, was healthy, was the body's natural cycle. But bleeding at other times suggested something wrong, an imbalance, a disease perhaps. The comfrey was hoped to correct this, to restore normal patterns, to stop inappropriate bleeding. Some old texts refer to comfrey for female debility, a vague term meaning general weakness in women, perhaps related to reproductive issues, to difficult childbirth, to the exhaustion of bearing and nursing multiple children, perhaps simply to anemia from too heavy bleeding or poor nutrition or chronic illness. Female debility was a catch-all diagnosis. When a woman was weak and tired, and the cause was unclear, this term might be used. And comfrey would be given as a tonic, as a strengthener. Hoped to restore vitality. This probably did not work. Comfrey does not treat anemia or exhaustion, does not provide nutrients or energy, but the act of giving medicine, of doing something, had value in itself, showed care, showed concern, and the mucilaginous liquid might have been comforting, might have eased digestive complaints that were contributing to poor nutrition. Comfrey syrup, sweetened with honey or sugar, was the usual preparation for internal use. The root would be boiled in water until the liquid was thick and strong, rich with mucilage, dark in color. Then it would be strained and sweetened to make it palatable. For medicine needs to be palatable, or people will not take it reliably. A spoonful would be taken several times daily, morning, midday, evening, before meals usually, so it could coat the digestive tract without food interfering. The patient would feel it going down thick, slippery, coating the throat, the esophagus, the stomach. There might be a sense of relief, of protection, of being cared for from within. Whether this relief came from actual pharmacological effect, or from the comfort of the coating sensation, or simply from believing in the medicine, we cannot separate. All three probably contributed. Medicine is never just chemistry. It is also psychology. Belief matters. Hope matters. Some preparations used wine instead of water. Wine was thought to be strengthening. To add its own virtues to the remedy, wine extracts different compounds than water. Alcohol is a different solvent. It pulls out different constituents. A comfrey root wine would be prepared by boiling the root in wine. Red wine usually, then straining, perhaps sweetening. Though wine is less in need of sweetening than water decoctions. This wine would be drunk in small amounts, a wine glass. Perhaps half a cup, not enough to intoxicate, but enough to deliver the medicine. The patient would feel the warmth of the wine spreading through them, would feel the coating of the mucilage, would hope for healing. This was often given for bleeding conditions, for consumption with blood in the sputum. The wine was thought to be heating, to stimulate, to strengthen the blood. Combined with comfrey's binding properties, it made a potent remedy, or so it was believed. There was also mention in some texts of comfrey for internal ruptures, for hernias. A hernia occurs when part of the intestine pushes through a weakness in the abdominal wall, creates a bulge, often painful. Hernias were common in an era of heavy manual labor, of lifting without modern understanding of body mechanics. They could be dangerous if the intestine became trapped, strangulated, blood flow cut off. Tissue would die, peritonitis would set in, death would follow. The old healers believed that comfrey, with its binding properties, might help heal the weakness in the abdominal wall, might strengthen the tissues, might close the opening. This seems implausible to modern understanding. A hernia is a structural problem. It needs surgical repair, mesh to strengthen the wall. But in an age without safe surgery, when opening the abdomen meant almost certain death from infection, what else could be tried? Comfrey was tried. Internal doses, external poultices over the hernia, both together. Did it work? Sometimes the hernia might seem to improve. The bulge might become less prominent, less painful. Was this the comfrey, or was it simply that the patient learned to avoid straining, learned to support the area, learned to live with the condition? We cannot know. But hope was offered, and sometimes hope is all medicine can provide. Some European folk traditions gave comfrey for what they called defective circulation. This might have meant various things: poor blood flow to the extremities, cold hands and feet, numbness, tingling or weakness, fatigue, pale complexion, the signs we might now associate with anemia or heart problems. The idea, perhaps, was that comfrey strengthened the blood vessels, kept blood where it should be, maintained proper flow. This theory seems to conflate several different concepts: blood volume, blood vessel integrity, heart function, circulation. But these distinctions were not clear in traditional medicine. Everything was understood in terms of humors, of balance, of qualities like hot and cold, wet and dry. If someone had poor circulation, they had too much cold and dryness, perhaps. Comfrey, being cold and dry itself, according to Culpeper, that does not make sense. The logic of traditional medicine seems contradictory to us sometimes. The theories do not hold together consistently. But they made sense at the time, within their own framework, within the worldview of humoral medicine, and the treatments sometimes worked. Not for the reasons given, but they worked, or seemed to work, which in the absence of controlled trials is the same thing. In traditional herbal theory, Comfrey was classified as cooling and moistening. This was part of a system going back to the ancient Greeks. All substances were categorized by their qualities, hot or cold, dry or moist. And treatments were chosen to balance the patient's condition. A person with fever had too much heat, give cooling remedies. A person with diarrhea had too much moisture, give drying remedies. Comfrey, being cooling and moistening, was indicated for hot, inflamed, dry conditions, inflamed mucous membranes, irritated stomach lining, dry, painful coughs. These were hot and dry conditions. Comfrey would cool them, moisten them, bring them back to balance. Restore health, at least. That was the theory. And the theory guided practice for many centuries. Whether patients actually got better because of proper application of this theory, or despite it, is impossible to say. Many people did get better, recovered from illnesses, healed from injuries. This is what medicine is for. And Comfrey was part of that healing. Whether it was the essential part or just part of a supportive environment that allowed natural healing to occur, we cannot now determine. What we can say is that people believed in it, trusted it, used it for generation after generation. But there was a problem with internal use of Comfrey, a serious problem, not recognized until quite recently. The root contains substances called pyrrolizidine alkaloids, complex organic compounds with rings of carbon and nitrogen. These alkaloids are toxic to the liver. They interfere with cell division, damage hepatocytes, the liver cells, not immediately, not with a single dose, but with regular prolonged use. They accumulate, the damage accumulates. The liver becomes diseased, scarred, fibrotic, unable to function properly. Veno-occlusive disease, it is called. The small veins in the liver become blocked. Symptoms might not appear for months or years. Abdominal pain, ascites, fluid accumulation in the abdomen. Jaundice, yellowing of the skin and eyes. By the time symptoms appear, the damage is often severe, sometimes irreversible, sometimes fatal. This was not known to the old herbalists. They had no way of analyzing the chemical constituents of plants, no way of detecting slow accumulation of liver damage over time. They could not see the pyrrolizidine alkaloids, could not measure them, could not track their effects in the body, and many people probably used Comfrey only occasionally for acute conditions, a week or two of treatment, then stopped. This would not have been enough to cause serious harm in most cases. The liver is remarkably resilient, can recover from limited exposure, but some people seeking relief from chronic conditions may have taken it daily, for months, for years, and some of those people may have developed liver disease, may have died from it, but it would not have been attributed to the Comfrey at the time. Liver disease was poorly understood, its causes unknown. Someone becoming jaundiced, developing abdominal swelling, would be diagnosed with some other condition, would be treated with other remedies. The connection to Comfrey would not have been made. The slow poisoning would have gone unrecognized. Today, health authorities in most countries advise strongly against internal use of Comfrey. The risk of liver damage is considered too great to justify the benefits, and there are alternatives, safer alternatives. Marshmallow root, slippery elm bark. These provide similar mucilaginous coating without the toxic alkaloids. So there is no need to risk Comfrey internally, no need to take that chance. This represents a major reversal. For 2,000 years, Comfrey was taken internally, was considered safe, was standard treatment. Now, It is forbidden, or at least strongly discouraged. The ancient practice has been abandoned. This is both progress and loss, progress in understanding, in safety, in protecting patients from harm. But loss of tradition, loss of confidence in old ways, loss of that sense that the ancients knew best. It is a reminder, I suppose, that tradition alone is not sufficient, that careful investigation can reveal hidden dangers, that what has always been done may not always be wise, that knowledge advances, that we learn. But it is also worth noting that external use appears to be safe. When applied to intact skin, very little of the alkaloid is absorbed into the bloodstream. The concentrations reaching the liver are minimal, not enough to cause harm, except perhaps with very prolonged use over very large areas of skin. So the ancient practice of using comfrey poultices and salves continues. That part of the tradition has been preserved, has been validated by modern research. The external use for injuries remains valid, useful, supported by evidence. This is good. This means the old knowledge was not entirely wrong, was right in important ways. Just not in every way, not in the internal use that is now recognized as dangerous. Let us pause again. Let the weight of all this internal use, all these hopes and theories and risks settle into our minds. The image of patients drinking comfrey syrup, hoping for healing, trusting in ancient wisdom, sometimes helped, sometimes harmed in ways they did not recognize. Medicine is always a balance of risks and benefits, always imperfect, always learning, always, we hope, improving. Segment 6, Household Farm, and Famine Comfrey was not only a medicine, not only a plant of the apothecary shop and the monastery infirmary. It was also, in various times and places, a food, a fodder crop, a fertilizer, a household resource with multiple uses. It occupied a curious position, you see, straddling the boundary between pharmacy and agriculture, between medicine and practical household management. This is something we have largely lost in our modern world of specialization, where medicines come from pharmacies, food comes from grocers, fertilizer comes in bags from garden centers. But in the past, these categories were more fluid. A single plant might serve many purposes, was valued for its versatility, and comfrey was particularly versatile, particularly useful in this multifaceted way. Let us explore these other roles, these other faces of comfrey beyond the medicinal. The plant itself is vigorous, remarkably vigorous. Once established, it grows, readily spreads, even if not contained. A single comfrey plant can grow 3 feet tall, 4 feet in good conditions, with leaves a foot long, coarse, hairy, substantial. And it comes back year after year, dies down in winter, sends up fresh growth in spring. Reliable, persistent. The roots go deep, very deep. This is one of comfrey's most remarkable characteristics. 6 feet down, 8 feet sometimes, deeper than almost any other garden plant, deeper than the plow reaches, deeper than most crops can grow. This deep rooting allows comfrey to access water other plants cannot reach to survive drought that would kill shallower rooted species. And it allows comfrey to access nutrients, minerals that have leached down below the topsoil. Potassium, especially nitrogen, phosphorus. The plant brings these nutrients up, draws them from deep in the earth, stores them in its leaves and stems. When the plant dies back, or when the leaves are cut, these nutrients are released, return to the topsoil. Enrich it. Farmers noticed this, observed that soil where comfrey grew became richer, more fertile, more productive, so they began deliberately planting comfrey. Not for medicine primarily, though that was a benefit, but for its effect on soil fertility. Using comfrey is what we now call a dynamic accumulator, a plant that mines nutrients from deep in the soil and makes them available to other plants. This was practical wisdom, observation, based agriculture, noticing what worked and doing more of it. The leaves could be cut several times in a growing season. Comfrey is remarkably productive. Cut it down in May, it grows back, cut it again in July. It grows back again. Sometimes a third cutting in September, 3 harvests from one planting substantial amounts of green matter. These cut leaves could be used in several ways, all of them valuable to the household economy. They could be spread on the garden as mulch, laid between rows of vegetables around fruit trees, wherever enrichment was needed. As they broke down, they would release their nutrients, would feed the soil, would improve structure and fertility. The leaves are high in potassium, particularly high. Potassium is essential for fruiting, for flowers and fruits and seeds. Tomatoes need potassium, potatoes, fruit trees, flowering plants of all kinds. So comfrey mulch was particularly valuable around these crops. It would boost yields, would improve quality. The gardener could see the difference. Tomatoes grown with comfrey mulch versus those without. The ones with comfrey were more productive, healthier, more vigorous. Or the leaves could be fermented in water to make a liquid fertilizer. This is an old technique, still used today by organic gardeners. Stuff fresh comfrey leaves into a barrel or bucket. Cover with water. Cover the container loosely. Let it sit over days and weeks. The leaves would break down, would ferment. The water would turn dark, would become thick, would develop a quite unpleasant smell. Strong, acrid, the smell of decomposition of biological processes at work. This liquid, when fully fermented, was incredibly rich in nutrients. A concentrated fertilizer, liquid gold, some called it. It would be diluted, usually about 10 parts water to 1 part comfrey liquid, mixed in a watering can, applied to plants. The effect was remarkable. Plants would green up within days, would grow vigorously, would produce abundantly. This comfrey tea, though, not the kind you would drink, was a valuable resource for any household with a garden. And it was free, cost nothing but labor. The effort of growing the comfrey, cutting it, fermenting it, applying it, in an economy where most people had little cash money, where self-sufficiency was essential, such free resources mattered greatly. A patch of comfrey in the garden could substantially improve food production, could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. The leaves were also fed to animals, livestock, particularly pigs, chickens, cattle, rabbits. Comfrey is high in protein, not as high as alfalfa or clover, but respectable, around 20% protein in the dried matter. And it grows abundantly, produces large volumes of green matter, can be harvested repeatedly. A smallholder with a patch of comfrey could supplement animal feed, could stretch limited resources further. Chickens would eat fresh comfrey leaves eagerly, would peck at them. The leaves would increase egg production, would improve the deep yellow color of the yolks. Pigs would eat it, though they preferred it mixed with other feeds rather than on its own. The hairy texture was not entirely appealing, but in times of scarcity, when other feed was expensive or unavailable, comfrey could fill the gap, could keep animals fed. Cattle could graze comfrey, or it could be cut and fed to them fresh, or dried into a hay-like product for winter feeding. Dairy cows fed on comfrey were said to produce richer milk. Whether this was true or simply perception based on expectation is hard to say. But farmers believed it, valued comfrey as cattle feed, planted it deliberately for this purpose. This was especially important in lean times when hay was scarce, when grain was expensive, when fodder crops failed. Comfrey, with its deep roots and vigorous growth, could survive conditions that killed other crops, could produce when other plants could not. This made it a kind of insurance, a backup resource, something to fall back on when times were hard. Which brings us to the Irish potato famine, a terrible tragedy of the 1840s, one of the worst humanitarian disasters in European history. Ireland in the 1840s depended heavily on potatoes, the poor especially. Potatoes were the main food, sometimes the only food. A small plot of land could produce enough potatoes to feed a family. The potato was calorie-dense, nutritious enough to sustain life. The population had grown, relied more and more on this single crop, put all their eggs, so to speak, in one basket. Then, in 1845, a disease struck, Phytophthora infestans potato blight, a fungal infection that spread rapidly in cool, wet conditions. The potatoes rotted in the fields in storage, everywhere. turning black and putrid, inedible, lost. The first year was bad, the second year worse. The blight returned. Again the crop failed, almost complete failure. People began to starve. Millions of people. The scale of suffering was immense. The British government response was inadequate, delayed, ideologically constrained. They believed in free markets, in not interfering. Public works were established. Poor relief, but not enough. Not nearly enough. And often poorly organized. People died. Hundreds of thousands, 1 million or more. The exact number is uncertain. So many deaths they could not all be recorded. Others fled, emigrated to America, to Canada, to anywhere that offered hope of survival. Another 1 million or more leaving Ireland. The population of Ireland dropped by a quarter. In just a few years, unimaginable tragedy. In this desperation, in this extremity, people ate anything they could find, anything that might sustain life. Nettles, seaweed, grass, which humans cannot properly digest, but which might fill the stomach, anything. And comfrey was one of those things, comfrey that grew in some gardens, in hedgerows, in damp places. The leaves could be cooked like spinach, boiled to soften them, to make them edible, despite the hairy texture. They were mucilaginous, not entirely pleasant, but they were food. They had substance, calories, protein, vitamins. In starvation, palatability becomes secondary. Survival is all that matters. The roots, too, could be eaten, peeled, boiled, mashed. Not tasty, not something anyone would eat by choice, but capable of sustaining life. How many people survived on comfrey during the famine, we cannot know. Likely not many. It was not widely cultivated at that time. But some did. Some households had comfrey growing, used it, survived because of it. And after the famine, there was renewed interest in comfrey, in alternative food sources, in not depending on a single crop. Some people promoted comfrey enthusiastically, claimed it was a wonder plant that could feed the world, a solution to hunger. This was exaggerated, greatly exaggerated. Comfrey alone cannot feed populations. It is not a complete food, not a replacement for grains and vegetables. But the underlying idea had merit. Diversification, not depending on a single crop, having multiple resources to draw on. If Ireland had grown more variety of foods, the potato blight would not have been so catastrophic, would not have caused such massive starvation. Different species and varieties of comfrey were introduced to different regions in this period, part of this drive to find alternative food and fodder sources. Russian comfrey, sometimes called Quaker comfrey, was brought from Russia to Britain around 1800, earlier than the famine, but promoted more vigorously after. This was a hybrid Symphytum uplandicum, a cross between common comfrey and a related species, more vigorous than common comfrey, larger leaves, higher yield, faster growing. It was promoted primarily as a fodder crop for feeding livestock, for enriching soil, for all the agricultural uses we have discussed, though it retained medicinal uses as well, could be prepared as poultices, as salves, in all the traditional ways. But its primary value in this era was agricultural, economic, practical, rather than medicinal. In some rural households, comfrey had other practical uses beyond medicine and agriculture. The strain decoction, very strong, was occasionally used in homemade soap, added to the lye and fat mixture. The mucilage affected the texture, made the soap somewhat softer, more soothing perhaps. Whether this made noticeably better soap is questionable, but it was one more use, one more way to make use of a versatile plant. Or the decoction might be used as a washing water for inflamed skin, for hands roughened by work, for chapped, sore skin, hands that had been washing clothes in harsh lye soap, or working in fields or handling tools. Rough, cracked, painful hands, a basin of warm comfrey decoction, soak the hands in it, let the mucilage soothe, let the warmth ease the aching. This was folk practice. Household practice, the kind of thing that might not appear in medical texts, but was passed down mother to daughter. Victorian herbals sometimes recommended comfrey for cosmetic purposes. This was a new use, or at least a newly documented one, for softening rough hands, for improving the complexion, for maintaining smooth skin. Ladies, it was suggested, might bathe their hands in comfrey decoction, or soak cloths in it, and lay them on the face, like a modern facial treatment. This seems quaint to us now, using a medicinal plant for cosmetics, but in an era before modern cosmetics, such plant-based treatments were the norm. Rosewater for the face, chamomile for lightening hair, comfrey for softening skin. These were the available options, and they probably did work to some degree. The mucilage would soften skin, would provide moisture, would soothe irritation. Not as effectively as modern moisturizers, perhaps, but better than nothing, better than harsh soaps and hard water alone. Some households grew comfrey simply because it was traditional, because their grandmothers had grown it, because it was useful to have on hand. A patch of comfrey in the garden, growing quietly, not demanding much attention, but there when needed, ready whenever someone suffered a sprain or a bruise, ready to be cut for mulch, ready to feed to the chickens, ready for whatever use might arise. This kind of multi-purpose resource was valuable in a household economy where nothing was wasted, where every resource was used fully. The roots for medicine, the leaves for mulch or animal feed, the flowers for bees, every part serving a purpose. This is efficient, elegant even, one plant serving multiple needs, contributing to household self-sufficiency in multiple ways. This blending of uses, medicinal and agricultural and household, is something we have largely lost in the modern world. We tend to specialize now. A plant is either a medicine or a food or an ornamental, rarely all three. Gardens are for ornament or for vegetables, but not usually for both. Not for herbs that serve multiple purposes. We buy medicine from pharmacies, buy food from stores, buy fertilizer in bags. Everything separated, compartmentalized. But in the past, such boundaries were more fluid, were less rigid. A household garden contained many types of plants serving many purposes. Vegetables for eating, herbs for medicine, plants for dyeing wool, plants to attract beneficial insects, plants for beauty. All mixed together. And comfrey fit into this system perfectly, was one element in a complex integrated household economy. The smallholder who grew comfrey knew its many uses, knew when to harvest it and how, knew what to do with it in various circumstances. If someone broke a bone, harvest root for medicine. If the garden needed enriching, cut leaves for mulch. If the pigs needed feeding, cut fresh growth for fodder. This was practical knowledge, essential knowledge, passed down through families, taught by example and by doing. A child growing up in such a household would learn these things, would help with the harvesting, would watch as comfrey was prepared in various ways, would absorb the knowledge almost unconsciously, would grow up understanding plants, understanding how to use resources, understanding self-sufficiency. This kind of knowledge is precious, is practical, is empowering in a deep way. When you know how to use the resources around you, you are less dependent, less vulnerable, more capable of caring for yourself and your family. But this knowledge has faded. Each generation that passes, less of it remains. Fewer people know how to use medicinal plants, how to make compost, how to be truly self-sufficient. We have gained much in modernity, comfort, convenience, safety, specialized expertise, but we have lost this intimacy with the plant world, this sense of partnership with nature, this practical self-sufficiency. Comfrey represents this older way of thinking, this integration of plant knowledge into daily life. It was not just a medicine to be bought from an apothecary. It was a living plant in the garden, a resource to be cultivated and used in multiple ways. This relationship with the plant was different, more intimate, more respectful, perhaps. When you grow a plant yourself, you understand it differently than when you simply purchase a product made from it. You see it through the seasons, see it grow and flower and die back, understand its nature, its preferences, its character. You notice things, which soil it prefers, how much water it needs, when it is most vigorous, when the roots should be harvested. This is relationship, this is knowledge of a different kind than book learning, embodied knowledge, experiential knowledge. Let us rest here for a moment in the quiet garden where comfrey grows. Imagine it. Tall stalks, swaying slightly in the breeze, coarse leaves, rough to the touch, purple flowers drooping on their stems. Bees visiting, humming the plant, serving many purposes: medicine, mulch, food for animals, enrichment for soil. All these uses contained in one vigorous plant. This is comfrey as it existed in traditional households. Not just a remedy, but a resource, a partner, a piece of integrated, sustainable living. Segment 7, across the Atlantic. Comfrey, in the New World comfrey, is a European plant, native to Britain. Too much of continental Europe, extending eastward through Central Asia, you would not find it in the Americas before European contact. It did not exist there. The ecosystems of the New World were different, distinct. But plants, like people, travel, especially plants that humans find useful, that they value, that they cannot imagine living without. And so comfrey came to the Americas, brought by colonists, carried across the Atlantic in the holds of ships. Imagine those voyages, months at sea. Cramped, dangerous, uncertain. Many people died on the crossing, disease, storms, shipwreck, and yet they brought plant seeds, cuttings, roots, carefully wrapped, carefully preserved, precious cargo. Why bring plants on such a dangerous journey? Why use precious cargo space for seeds and roots? Because they needed them, needed familiar plants, needed medicines, needed food plants, needed to recreate something of home in this strange land. European colonists sailing to North America or South America or the Caribbean brought many plants with them. Food plants, certainly wheat, barley, familiar vegetables, things they would need to survive to establish agriculture, but also medicinal plants, seeds and roots of healing, herbs, the pharmacy of home, transplanted to the New World. Comfrey was among these plants, too valuable, too trusted, too necessary to leave behind. Imagine a colonist's medicine chest, a wooden box with compartments and small bottles, carefully packed for the journey, dried herbs, wrapped in paper or cloth, tinctures in glass bottles, tools for preparing remedies, and somewhere in that collection, comfrey root, dried and wrapped carefully. Or perhaps a small live plant, potted, kept alive during the voyage, to be planted when they reached land. This comfrey represented continuity, connection to home, the familiar healing practices in an unfamiliar place. The early settlements were hard places. Life was difficult, dangerous. The death rate was high in the first years. Disease, accidents, conflict with indigenous peoples, starvation when crops failed, harsh winters, unknown dangers. Trees fell on people, axes slipped and cut deep, bones broke, wounds festered in the humid heat, fevers came and would not break, and there were no physicians often, though apothecary shops. Each household had to be self-sufficient in medicine, had to rely on what they knew, what they had brought. So the plants they brought mattered perhaps even more than they had in Europe, where you could consult a physician, could buy remedies from an apothecary here. You had only yourself, your knowledge, your resources, your medicine chest, and your garden. Comfrey adapted well to North America. The climate suited it in many regions, similar to Northern Europe. Cool winters, adequate rainfall, it grew readily, spread naturally in some areas, became established in gardens, in dooryards around farmhouses, a familiar plant in a foreign land, a piece of home growing in alien soil. And it was used much as it had been used in Europe, for wounds, for fractures, for sprains, for all the injuries of frontier life, of clearing land, of felling massive trees with axes and saws, of building structures with heavy timbers, of ploughing rocky soil, of surviving. The farmer would dig comfrey from his garden as needed. His wife would prepare it. They would apply it to injuries, to their own injuries, to their children's, to their neighbors. The knowledge of how to do this was brought from the old country. was taught to children born in the new land, was passed forward. And so the tradition continued, transplanted, but recognizable. Comfrey in America serving the same purposes it had served in Europe, Native American peoples. Encountering these European plants, sometimes adopted them into their own medicine. This is worth pausing to consider. The exchange of knowledge, the flow of information between cultures. Native Americans had their own sophisticated knowledge of plants, hundreds of medicinal species, complex preparations, and protocols. Knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. They knew their landscape intimately, knew which plants grew where, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, what they treated. But they were also pragmatic, practical, open to new knowledge if it proved useful. When Europeans arrived with their plants, with their remedies, native healers observed, experimented, tested. If something worked, regardless of its origin, it might be worth incorporating, worth adding to the pharmacopoeia. This was not wholesale adoption, not uncritical acceptance, but selective integration of what proved valuable. There are records of Cherokee healers using comfrey, of various tribal groups incorporating it into their medicine. They used it for injuries, as the Europeans did, the same logical uses for a plant with binding properties for wounds, for broken bones, for sprains, but also internally for coughs, for women's complaints, the internal uses that were common in European practice. The uses were similar to European uses. The plant was the same, after all, it had the same properties, the same effects, whether used by Europeans or by Native Americans. What is interesting is how knowledge flowed in both directions, not just Europeans imposing their knowledge. Europeans learned from Native Americans about local plants, echinacea, golden seal, black cohosh, many plants unknown in Europe, and Native Americans adopted some European plants. Comfrey, plantain, dandelion, plants that proved useful in the American context. A two-way exchange, a blending of traditions, each culture learning from the other, taking what was useful, integrating it. This enriched both traditions, created something new, American herbalism that drew on both European and indigenous knowledge. Though we must acknowledge that this exchange occurred in the context of colonialism, of displacement, of terrible injustice to indigenous peoples. The knowledge exchange was real. But it happened against a backdrop of violence and appropriation that cannot be ignored. Still, the plant knowledge itself has value, the sharing of healing wisdom, the recognition that different traditions might teach each other. Comfrey became part of this American blending, European in origin but adapted to American use, incorporated into various traditions. As the colonies grew into a nation, as the frontier moved ever westward, comfrey moved with it. Covered wagons heading west often carried comfrey root. Among the precious cargo, the seeds and plants and cuttings, the material for establishing a new homestead. Each new settlement, each new farm would plant a medicine garden, and comfrey would likely be included. By the 19th century, comfrey was thoroughly naturalized in many parts of North America. A common plant, a familiar, established. It grew in gardens, in old homesteads, in abandoned settlements where people had moved on. In waste places along roadsides in some regions, escaped from cultivation in some areas. Growing wild, self-seeding, establishing itself as if it were native. To someone not knowing the history, comfrey might seem like it had always been there, like it belonged to the American landscape. The eclectic physicians of the 19th century took comfrey seriously. This is worth discussing. The eclectics were an important movement in American medicine. They arose as a reaction to the harsh treatments of mainstream medicine, bloodletting, mercury dosing, treatments that often killed as much as they cured. The eclectics promoted a gentler approach, plant-based remedies primarily, careful observation, respect for the body's own healing capacity. They were not folk healers. They were trained physicians, with schools, with textbooks, with professional standards. The first eclectic medical school was founded in 1830. In Cincinnati, Ohio, others followed at their height. There were several eclectic medical schools. They granted medical degrees, trained practitioners systematically, published journals, conducted research of a sort. They represented an alternative to mainstream regular medicine, were popular among patients who distrusted harsh treatments. And they used plants extensively, had their own materia medica, their own pharmacopoeia, their own preferred remedies. Comfrey had a place in eclectic medicine, was listed in their textbooks with specific indications, specific preparations, specific doses for gastrointestinal bleeding, for chronic diarrhea, for dysentery, for bronchial problems, for wounds and injuries. The uses were similar to European uses, but specified more precisely, with more attention to dose and preparation and duration of treatment. This represented professionalization, systematization, taking folk knowledge and organizing it into medical practice. Eclectic texts described comfrey root preparations, how to make decoctions, what strength, how often to administer, for how long. They documented cases, kept records, built an evidence base of sorts, not controlled trials, certainly, but systematic observation. If comfrey seemed to help most cases of a certain condition, it was recommended. If it seemed ineffective or harmful, it was discontinued. This was practical, empirical medicine, not perfect, but not purely theoretical either, grounded in observation of actual patients. One interesting aspect of American comfrey use was its continued availability. In Europe, by the 19th century, many people lived in cities, would buy herbs from an apothecary rather than gathering them themselves. But in rural America, many people still grew their own, still had that direct relationship with the plant, still were self-sufficient. This persisted longer in America than in Britain or continental Europe. The frontier mentality, the necessity of self-reliance, the distance from shops and services. Homesteading guides, popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, often mention comfrey. These were practical books for practical people, how to build a cabin, how to establish a farm, how to be self-sufficient. And they included sections on household medicine, on growing and using medicinal plants. Comfrey was typically included, how to grow it, where to plant it, when to harvest, how to prepare it for various uses, how to use it for family medicine. These guides assumed that you would be far from doctors, far from pharmacies, that you would need to handle medical emergencies yourself. A broken bone, a deep cut, a serious burn, you could not wait days for help to arrive. You had to do something immediately. Comfrey was part of that self-sufficiency, part of being prepared, part of being able to care for your family in isolation. During the World Wars, both First and Second, there was renewed interest in home medicine, in self-sufficiency, in making do with what you had. Physicians were scarce, many serving in the military. Medicines might be rationed or unavailable. People had to rely on themselves more. There was official encouragement to grow victory gardens for food primarily, but also for medicinal plants. Government pamphlets discussed useful plants, how to grow them, how to prepare simple remedies in case of need, in case of emergency. Comfrey was mentioned in some of these materials for external use primarily, for cuts, scrapes, bruises, for minor injuries that might otherwise go untreated. Home first aid using plants, a return to older practices, out of necessity, out of wartime conditions. People who had forgotten about comfrey, whose grandmothers had used it, but who had not, now returned to it, planted it again, learned to use it again, rediscovered old knowledge. But then, after the wars, modern medicine advanced rapidly. Antibiotics became widely available, painkillers, advanced surgical techniques. These were genuinely effective, worked better than plant remedies in most cases, saved lives that would have been lost before. People reasonably preferred them, chose modern medicine over traditional remedies. This was logical, understandable. Comfrey began to seem old-fashioned, something grandmothers knew about, not something modern people used. By mid-20th century, comfrey's popularity had waned significantly in mainstream American culture. It still grew in old gardens. Old people still knew about it, but younger generations often did not. Had not been taught, did not see the need. Why learn about comfrey when you could just go to the doctor? get a prescription, get proper medical care. The knowledge began to fade. Each generation, less of it remained. Fewer people knew how to identify comfrey, how to prepare it, how to use it. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, something interesting happened. The counterculture movement, a return to natural living, young people, rejecting modern consumerism, sought older ways. They started organic farms, learned traditional crafts, valued indigenous knowledge. They studied herbalism, read old texts, sought out elderly people who remembered traditional plant use, wanted to learn. And comfrey experienced a renaissance of sorts, became popular again. But in a new context, among a new generation, these young herbalists read Culpeper, read the eclectic texts, read anything they could find about medicinal plants. They grew comfrey in their gardens, used it themselves, wrote about it in the new herbalism books that were being published. Health food stores began selling comfrey products, ointments and salves, tablets for internal use. Teas, comfrey became associated with natural health, with alternative medicine, with living close to the earth. This was also when the safety concerns emerged, the discovery of pyrrolizidine alkaloids, the recognition of liver toxicity risk. Researchers began investigating, testing comfrey in animals, documenting liver damage, finding case reports of humans affected. This caused controversy, debate within the herbal community. Many felt the risks were exaggerated, that traditional use proved safety. But the regulatory agencies were cautious, decided the risks were too great, began restricting internal use. By the 1980s and 90s, warnings were being issued, products were being pulled from the market, labels were being changed. In the United States, the FDA advised against internal use, did not ban it outright, but strongly discouraged it. Some states went further, banned the sale of comfrey for internal use entirely, allowed only external products. This was a major shift. After nearly 2 centuries of comfrey use in America, suddenly it was considered dangerous, restricted. The herbalist community was divided. Some accepted the restrictions, acknowledged the risks, switched to safer alternatives like marshmallow. Others resisted, felt that government was overreaching, that people should be free to use traditional remedies, that the evidence was not conclusive. The debate continued for years, still continues in some circles, though the mainstream medical position is clear. Internal use is not recommended. Today, in the United States, comfrey exists in a complex regulatory and cultural space. It is legal to grow, legal to use externally. You can buy comfrey ointments and salves in health food stores and online. But internal use is discouraged. Products for internal use are rare. Most labels carry warnings. The message is clear, external use only. Short term, not on broken skin, not for children or pregnant women. Caution, caution, caution. This represents a remarkable transformation from trusted household remedy to restricted substance in just a few decades. The same plant that traveled in covered wagons, that homesteaders relied on, that eclectic physicians prescribed, now carries warnings. This is progress in safety, in understanding, in protecting people from harm, but it is also loss of tradition, loss of confidence in old ways. Many Americans today have never heard of comfrey, do not know what it looks like, have no idea it was once a common household medicine. The knowledge has faded dramatically, even in rural areas where it once would have been universal. Older people remember their grandparents used it, perhaps they remember hearing about it, but they never learned to use it themselves. And the next generation knows nothing at all. The thread is broken. The transmission has failed. Yet the plant persists, still grows in old gardens, in abandoned homesteads, in wild places where it has naturalized. You can still find it if you know what to look for, growing quietly, unnoticed by most people, waiting. Some herbalists still use it, still value it, still teach about it, keep the knowledge alive in small pockets, in alternative communities. The tradition has not entirely died, has gone underground perhaps, but persists. In some ways, the American story of comfrey mirrors the larger American story. European traditions transplanted, adapted to new conditions, blended with indigenous knowledge, becoming something new, something American, then changing with modernity, industrialization, urbanization, medicalization, being transformed almost beyond recognition, but not entirely lost, still present, still accessible to those who seek it, still part of the landscape, literally and culturally. Let us rest here, on this American soil where comfrey grows, where it has grown for centuries now, where it has its own history, its own story, different from its European story but connected to it, branching from the same root, growing in a new direction, adapted to new conditions. This is how knowledge travels, how plants travel, how traditions evolve, changed by new contexts, but carrying something essential forward. Segment 8, Animals, Massachusetts, geek, and protection. We have spoken much of comfrey as human medicine, as a remedy for human ailments, human wounds, human broken bones, but humans were not the only patients, not the only creatures who benefited from comfrey. As healing properties, animals too were treated with comfrey. This veterinary use was important, practical, and often quite effective, in some ways perhaps even more important than human medicine, because animals represented wealth, livelihood, survival. Consider the economy of the past, of agricultural societies of times before mechanization. Animals were essential, not pets, not companions, though affection certainly existed, but working partners, economic assets, crucial resources. A farmer's horse pulled the plow, pulled the wagon to market, was transportation and power and wealth altogether. Lose the horse and you might lose everything. Might not be able to work your land, might not be able to get crops to market, might face ruin. So horse medicine mattered greatly. A lame horse was a serious problem, a crisis, not just inconvenience, but potential disaster. And horses, working hard, pulling heavy loads, were prone to injuries, strains, brains, bruises, leg problems especially. The legs bear all the weight, are under constant stress, are vulnerable to injury. Traditional farriers, the specialists who cared for horses' feet and legs, knew comfrey very well. Farriers were not just blacksmiths shoeing horses, they were veterinary specialists, experts in equine leg and foot problems. They had their own knowledge, their own remedies, their own techniques, passed down master to apprentice through generations, and comfrey was one of their primary remedies. A staple, something every farrier would know, would use regularly for sprains in horses, for pulled tendons, for strains and stresses to the complex structures of the equine leg. A horse working hard, pulling a plow through heavy soil, could easily strain a tendon, develop inflammation, painful swelling, or pulling a loaded wagon up a steep hill. The strain on the legs, the stress on tendons and ligaments, or a misstep, foot coming down wrong in a hole, a sudden wrench damage to joints or tendons. The farrier would examine the leg carefully, feel for heat, for swelling, for pain response, skilled hands reading the injury through touch. Then he would prepare comfrey, mashed fresh root usually, or a strong decoction if fresh root was not available. The comfrey would be spread on cloth or sometimes applied directly to the leg, then wrapped, bound in place with strips of cloth. The horse would be rested, kept in the stall, not worked, given time to heal. The poultice would be changed daily or every other day, depending on severity, on how the injury was responding. The farrier would monitor progress, would feel the leg regularly, checking for reduction in heat, in swelling, for signs of healing. Sometimes improvement was rapid, the swelling would go down. The horse would bear weight more comfortably, would walk without obvious pain. Other times it was slow, required weeks of treatment, of patience, of continued rest and application of comfrey. For bruises in horses, deep bruises to muscle, from kicks, from impacts, from the constant minor traumas of hard work. A bruise in a working muscle can be debilitating, can cause lameness, can prevent the horse from working. Comfrey poultices would be applied, mucilage soothing. The binding properties, it was believed, helping the damaged tissue heal, Whether Comfrey truly accelerated healing or simply kept the area clean and provided a physical support that aided recovery is hard to say. But farriers believed it worked, used it consistently, passed the knowledge down. This suggests some effectiveness, minimum, through empirical observation. There was a condition called windgalls, soft, fluid-filled swellings around the fetlock joint. Just above the hoof, these were not usually painful, but they indicated strain, overwork, stress on the joint and surrounding structures. If left untreated, if the horse continued to be worked hard, windgalls could progress to more serious problems, to permanent damage. So they were treated, and Comfrey was a common treatment. Poultices applied to reduce the swelling, to support the stressed tissues, to prevent progression. This was preventive medicine, in a sense, catching problems early, before they became serious, before they caused permanent lameness. A wise owner, a careful farrier, would watch for windgalls, would treat them promptly, would give the horse time to recover. This preserved the animal's working life, kept them sound, kept them valuable. For bone fractures in horses, Comfrey was sometimes tried, though we must be honest about the prognosis. A broken bone in a horse is very serious, often fatal. This is important to understand. Horses are large animals, heavy. They cannot rest a leg completely, cannot go on bed, rest the way a human can. If a horse tries to bear all its weight on 3 legs, the other legs are at risk. The hooves can founder from bearing too much weight. The horse can develop laminitis, painful, disabling, often fatal itself. So a serious fracture, a complete break of a major bone, usually meant the horse had to be destroyed. A terrible decision, but a practical one. If the animal could not be saved, would suffer terribly, would likely die anyway. Euthanasia was a mercy. But for less severe fractures, hairline cracks, incomplete breaks, small bones, there might be a chance. The leg would be splinted, bound, and Comfrey would be applied. Poultices covering the fracture site. The horse would be supported sometimes, hung in a sling that bore some of his weight, allowed the legs to rest more, or confined to a very small stall, where it could not move around, could not put weight on the injured leg. This was difficult. Horses are meant to move. Confinement stresses them. They can become anxious, depressed even. But it was the only hope for healing. For some fractures in some horses, and sometimes, rarely, the bone would heal, the horse would recover, would be able to work again, though perhaps not as hard as before. Whether the Comfrey contributed to this healing, or whether it was simply the immobilization and rest, is impossible to determine. But the association was there. Comfrey was part of the treatment protocol, was part of the attempt to save the animal. Modern horse medicine still uses Comfrey. This is worth noting. The tradition continues in adapted form. Topical preparations, salves and liniments applied to legs, to joints, to areas of strain and injury, often combined with other ingredients. Arnica for bruising, camphor for warmth, for increased circulation to the area, menthol sometimes for cooling effect, for pain relief. These combination products are popular in stables, for sport horses, for race horses, for show horses, for working horses, horses that are asked to perform at high levels, that experience significant stress on their legs and joints. The modern formulations are standardized, regulated, tested for safety. Not the same as medieval farriers' poultices, but the principle is the same. The recognition that Comfrey has value in treating equine injuries. This continuity across centuries. Other animals were treated with Comfrey as well. Cattle, those large, valuable animals that provided milk, meat, leather, labor. Cattle injuries were less common, perhaps, than horse injuries. Cattle moved more slowly, were not worked as hard in pulling, but they still had injuries, especially leg injuries, sprains from uneven ground, bruises from jostling in tight spaces. And there were difficulties with calving, with giving birth. Sometimes the calf would be positioned wrong. The birth would be difficult, traumatic. The cow might be torn internally, might bleed, might be left weakened and damaged. Comfrey would be given internally sometimes. to help heal the internal trauma, to stop bleeding, to promote recovery. Whether this helped or harmed, given what we now know about the alkaloids, is uncertain. Some cows recovered, others did not. Dogs were treated with comfrey, working dogs especially, herding dogs, hunting dogs, guard dogs, dogs that might be injured in the course of their work, kicked by livestock, injured in fights with predators, hurt in accidents, a broken leg in a dog, a deep cut, a painful joint from arthritis in an older dog. Comfrey would be applied externally. Poultices for wounds, for fractures, for strains. Dogs tolerate this treatment well. Generally, will often leave a bandage alone if it is not too irritating, and dogs heal quickly, have good recovery capacity. A young, healthy dog with proper treatment often heals well. Whether the comfrey significantly helped, or whether the dog would have healed anyway with just rest and cleanliness, is hard to determine. But people believed it helped, continued to use it, passed the knowledge down. Cats were treated with comfrey more rarely. Cats are independent, hard to treat. They will remove bandages, will not tolerate confinement well. And cats often heal on their own, have remarkable recovery ability, hide when injured, emerge when healed. So there was less intervention with cats, less need for it, perhaps, less tolerance for it, certainly. But occasionally for a particularly valued cat or a severe injury, comfrey might be tried. Farm manuals from the 19th and early 20th centuries included veterinary sections, substantial sections sometimes, how to treat common animal ailments, how to handle injuries, how to maximize the health and productivity of livestock. These manuals were practical, written for farmers who could not afford to call a veterinarian for every problem, who needed to handle things themselves. And comfrey appeared in these veterinary sections along with other remedies. Part of the farm's medical toolkit. How to treat a cow with a difficult birth, how to help a dog with a broken leg, how to handle a horse with a sprained tendon. Comfrey featured prominently, was recommended regularly, was considered reliable and effective. This represents comfrey's acceptance into formal veterinary practice. Not just folk use, but professional recommendation. During wartime, when horses were used extensively in military operations, comfrey had a military veterinary role. Cavalry horses, artillery horses pulling guns, supply wagons pulled by teams of horses, all these animals were essential to military operations, and they were injured constantly. The stress of military service, long marches, heavy loads, battles. Army veterinarians treated these injured horses, had field hospitals for horses, protocols for treatment, and comfrey was part of their toolkit. Simple, available, reasonably effective for common injuries. A cavalry horse injured in battle, a sprain, a cut, a bruise from a fall. The veterinarian would assess whether the horse could be saved, whether it was worth the effort. Resources were limited in wartime. If the injury was treatable, comfrey would be applied, standard treatment, then rest if possible, or return to service if the injury was minor enough. The horse either recovered or it did not. If it did not, if it became too lame to work, it might be retired or destroyed if retirement was not practical. War was hard on horses. Thousands died, thousands more were injured. The veterinarians did what they could with limited resources. Now let us turn to a different aspect, less practical, more symbolic, the magical and protective uses of comfrey. This might seem strange after all, our discussion of practical medicine, of empirical observation, of what works. But we must remember that in traditional cultures, the boundary between practical and spiritual was fluid, not rigid as it is for us. A plant could be both medicine and magic, both physical remedy and spiritual symbol. The categories overlapped. In European folk magic, plants were not only physical substances, they were also carriers of meaning, of power, of symbolic associations. Each plant had its character, its nature, its spiritual as well as physical properties. And these spiritual properties could be worked with, used, incorporated into ritual and practice. Comfrey, with its binding and knitting properties, naturally acquired symbolic associations. Metaphorical meanings. If it bound bones, perhaps it could bind other things, could bind a person to their home, could bind good fortune to a household, could bind protection around a traveler. This was magical thinking, sympathetic magic. The principle that effects like that properties transfer symbolically, but it was not necessarily seen as different from physical medicine. The physical and spiritual were connected, part of the same reality. It was said to protect travelers. A piece of comfrey root, carried in a pocket or a bag, would ensure safe return. This made a certain poetic sense. If comfrey could bind wounds, could hold things together, perhaps it could bind a person to their destination, hold them safe, bring them back. Whether anyone truly believed this literally, or whether it was more of a hopeful gesture, a kind of prayer, is hard to say. But the custom existed, was recorded, was passed down. Some people observed it. Travel was dangerous in the past. We forget how dangerous. Roads were poor, banditry common, accident frequent. Leaving home for a journey meant real risk. Of injury, of robbery, of getting lost, of never returning. So people sought protection through prayers, through amulets, through carrying protective substances. A piece of comfrey root was one such protective amulet. Small, easily carried, connected to the plant's healing and binding power. Comfrey was also placed in luggage to prevent loss or theft. Again, the binding symbolism, the idea that the luggage would be bound to the traveler, would not go astray, would not be taken by thieves. This seems quaint to us now. Magical thinking that we have outgrown. But consider what it represented, an attempt to exert some control over an uncertain world, to feel safer in the face of real dangers. And the act itself of deliberately placing comfrey in your luggage created mindfulness, made you more careful, more aware. Perhaps you watched your belongings more carefully because you had ritually protected them. The magic worked through psychology, or perhaps it was pure superstition with no effect at all. But if it made people feel safer, feel more in control, that had value. In an uncertain world, in an age of real dangers, anything that reduced anxiety was worthwhile. In some magical traditions, comfrey was associated with specific goddesses. With powerful female deities, Hecate, the Greek goddess of crossroads and magic, of boundaries and transitions, of the liminal spaces between worlds. Why Hecate should be linked to comfrey is not entirely obvious, but there are connections. Hecate is a goddess of healing as well as magic, is associated with plants and herbs, with knowledge of medicinal properties. And she is a goddess of protection, especially of those traveling, those crossing boundaries, those in transition. So perhaps the association makes sense. Comfrey is a plant of healing and protection, Hecate as goddess of the same. The plant becomes sacred to the goddess, used in rituals, honoring her, carried by those who invoke her protection. Kali, the Hindu goddess, is also mentioned in some traditions. Kali of destruction and transformation. This seems stranger. Kali is fierce, terrifying, associated with death and destruction, as much as with creation. But Kali is also a goddess of transformation, of breaking down the old to make way for the new. And healing is transformation, the destruction of damaged tissue, the creation of new, healthy tissue in its place. Comfrey participates in this transformative process, breaks down what is broken, helps build what is new. Perhaps this is the connection. The recognition that healing involves destruction and creation, both death and rebirth in miniature. Nip bone breaks down damaged tissue and builds new bone. Small death, small rebirth, transformation. Comfrey was used in binding spells. This is frequently mentioned in magical herbalism texts. Not binding in a harmful sense necessarily, not to constrain or imprison, but to bind things together that should be together, to bind two people in love or friendship in a hand-fasting ceremony, a commitment ritual. The couple would exchange vows, and comfrey might be woven into cords that bound their hands together, symbolizing their union. Or to bind a promise to ensure it would be kept. To seal an agreement, the parties would hold Comfrey while making their pledge, symbolizing the binding nature of their words, or to mend a relationship after conflict, to repair what was broken, to restore unity, Comfrey as a symbol of reconciliation, of bringing back together what had been separated, of healing emotional wounds as it healed physical ones. The plant that bound bones could bind other things. This made intuitive sense, was a natural metaphor, and rituals using Comfrey for this purpose gave people a way to mark important moments, to add weight and significance to their commitments. Whether there was any magical effect beyond the psychological impact is impossible to say, but the psychological impact itself was real and valuable. Some practitioners made amulets from Comfrey root, small carved pieces worn on a cord around the neck or carried in a pocket or pouch. These were meant to protect the wearer, to keep them whole and unbroken, to prevent injury. A soldier might wear one, a traveler, someone engaged in dangerous work. The amulet was a physical reminder of care, of protection, of hope for safety. Whether it actually protected is questionable, but it might have made the wearer more mindful, more careful, more aware of danger and the comfort it provided. The reduction in anxiety had real value. Fear and anxiety can be debilitating, can impair judgment. Something that reduced fear might actually increase safety indirectly by allowing clearer thinking, steadier action. In some household traditions, Comfrey was planted near the home for protection, not just to have it available medicinally, though that was part of it, but as a kind of guardian plant, keeping the household safe. This blending of practical and symbolic use is characteristic of folk traditions. A plant could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Medicinal resource, symbolic protector, agricultural asset, all at once, all valid, all part of how the plant was understood. Looking at these magical uses from our modern, rational perspective, they seem quaint, perhaps foolish, superstitious, but they represent something important that we have perhaps lost. The human need to feel safe, to have some sense of control over an uncertain world, and they represent a deep relationship with plants, an intimacy, a sense that plants are not just objects to be used, but partners, allies, beings with their own power. When you carry a piece of Comfrey root in your pocket for protection, you are aware of it, you think about it. You notice the plant growing, its smell, its texture, its appearance. You have a relationship with it, personal, individual. This awareness, this relationship is valuable in itself. Regardless of any magical effect, it connects you to the plant world, to nature, to the earth. We have lost much of this in modern life. We use products made from plants, but rarely know the plants themselves. We have become disconnected, separated. We consume, but do not relate. The magical use of Comfrey, for all its seeming superstition, represented connection, relationship, partnership with the plant world, and perhaps that is what we should learn from it. Not that Comfrey root literally protects travelers, but that relating to plants, knowing them, connecting with them, has value. Let us rest here. In this liminal space between the practical and the mystical, between the horse barn and the witch-esque cottage, between medicine and meaning, between healing and protection, Comfrey serving all these purposes, or believed to serve them, being more than just a remedy, being symbol, being ally, being sacred. Segment 9. The modern turn, science and restriction. We come now to the modern era, to an age of scientific investigation, of systematic inquiry, of controlled experiments. An age that looks at the old remedies with new eyes, new tools, new methods of understanding. How did Comfrey fare in this new world? What happened when ancient remedies met modern scrutiny? The answer is complex. Neither entirely vindicated nor entirely condemned. Something more nuanced, more interesting, perhaps. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, chemistry was advancing rapidly. The chemists had new techniques, new equipment, new capabilities. They could isolate compounds from plants, purify them, identify their structures, understand their properties. This was revolutionary. For thousands of years, people had used plants without knowing what was in them, what made them work. Now, finally, that could be discovered. The active ingredients could be found. The mechanisms could be understood. Chemists began analyzing plant medicines systematically, taking the remedies that had been used for centuries, breaking them down, finding out what they contained. Some plants yielded powerful drugs, morphine from poppies, digitalis from foxglove, salicylic acid from willow bark, which would become aspirin. These discoveries validated some traditional uses, showed that the old healers had been onto something real, something that chemistry could now explain and refine. Other plants yielded less dramatic results, useful compounds, but nothing revolutionary, nothing that would transform medicine. From Comfrey, chemists isolated a compound called allantoin. This was in the late 19th century. The exact date varies in different sources. Allantoin is a simple organic compound. Chemically speaking, it is a diaride of glyoxylic acid. That means nothing to most people, including myself. But what it does is more interesting than what it is. Allantoin promotes cell proliferation, encourages the growth of new tissue, stimulates granulation in wounds. When a wound heals, new tissue must grow to fill the gap. New cells must multiply, must organize themselves into functional tissue. Allantoin encourages this process, speeds it somewhat, makes it more efficient. This was exciting. Here was a chemical explanation for Comfrey's traditional use, for its reputation as a wound healer, as knitbone. The old herbalist had been right. Comfrey did promote healing, and now we knew why, at least in part. Allantoin became valuable, was extracted from Comfrey, was synthesized in laboratories, was incorporated into products, wound dressings, skin creams, cosmetics products for promoting skin health and healing. It is still used today. You can find it listed on ingredient labels if you look. Allantoin, derived originally from Comfrey, though now usually synthesized. So part of Comfrey was vindicated. Its wound healing reputation had a basis in chemistry, in real measurable effects. This felt like progress, like the old knowledge meeting new understanding, like tradition being validated by science, and it was progress, genuine progress. Understanding mechanisms, refining applications, making treatments more targeted and effective. But there was another discovery, a darker one, a troubling one. Comfrey contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids, several different ones, with names like symphytum and ecimidine and others, equally complex. Alkaloids are organic compounds containing nitrogen. Plants produce them for various reasons. Often for defense against herbivores, many alkaloids are toxic to animals, to humans. This is their evolutionary purpose, to discourage consumption. Some alkaloids are useful medicinally in small doses. Morphine, caffeine, nicotine, which was once used as an insecticide. But pyrrolizidine alkaloids, the kind found in Comfrey, are particularly problematic, particularly toxic. They damage the liver, not immediately, not with a single dose, but cumulatively, over time, with repeated exposure. The way they work is insidious. The alkaloids themselves are not highly toxic, but when the liver metabolizes them, breaks them down, the breakdown products are toxic. These metabolites bind to DNA, interfere with cell division, damage the hepatocytes, the liver cells. Over time, with repeated exposure, this damage accumulates. The liver becomes scarred, fibrotic, hardened with scar tissue. The small veins in the liver become blocked. Blood cannot flow properly. This is called veno-occlusive disease. The liver cannot function properly, cannot detoxify the blood, cannot produce necessary proteins, cannot perform its hundreds of essential functions. Eventually, if exposure continues, the liver fails, and liver failure is fatal without a transplant. The pyrrolizidine alkaloids are also potentially carcinogenic, potentially capable of causing cancer. The mechanism is similar: damage to DNA, interference with normal cell division, mutations accumulating over time. Whether Comfrey specifically causes cancer in humans is not definitively proven, but the theoretical risk exists. The compounds are known to be carcinogenic in animals, so there is concern, caution, wariness. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, a plant used safely for millennia was revealed as dangerous, or had it been safe? This was the question. The troubling question: how many people over the centuries had suffered liver damage without anyone connecting it to Comfrey, without anyone recognizing the cause? We cannot know. Medical recognizing the core. Until recently, diagnostic capabilities were limited, cause and effect were difficult to establish. Liver disease was recognized as a condition. Jaundice, abdominal swelling, pain, decline, death. But the causes were mysterious, blamed on bad air, on imbalance of humors, on various factors that we now know were irrelevant. Someone taking Comfrey daily for months, developing liver disease, would not have had the Comfrey suspected, would not have made that connection. The slow poisoning would have gone unrecognized, attributed to something else, or to no specific cause, just ill fortune. So the alkaloids were always there, always toxic. But their effects were hidden, obscured by ignorance, by lack of understanding. Only when chemistry could analyze the plant's constituents, when medicine could identify specific types of liver damage, did the truth emerge. This is both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring that we can now identify such dangers, troubling that they were hidden for so long. Researchers began conducting animal studies. This was in the mid-20th century. Testing Comfrey systematically, rats were fed Comfrey, various preparations, various doses. For various durations, the results were clear. Consistent, disturbing. Rats fed Comfrey developed liver disease, developed tumors, died from liver failure. The damage was dose-dependent. More Comfrey meant more damage. Longer exposure meant more damage. But even relatively small amounts, given repeatedly over time, caused problems. This was concerning, very concerning. It suggested that even traditional doses taken regularly might be harmful. The studies were published, discussed, debated, created controversy in the herbal community. Some argued that rats are not humans, that animal studies do not always predict human effects, that traditional use over millennia proves safety. If Comfrey were truly dangerous, they said, we would have noticed. People would have died in obvious patterns. The harm would have been recognized, but others pointed out that the harm might have been there all along, just not recognized, not connected to the cause, and that even if most people tolerated Comfrey, some might be harmed, and protecting those vulnerable individuals mattered. Human case reports began to appear. People who had taken Comfrey internally, sometimes for extended periods, developing liver problems. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough to be concerning, enough to establish a pattern. A woman taking Comfrey tea daily for arthritis develops abdominal pain, jaundice, diagnosed with veno-occlusive disease. Her liver failing, a man taking Comfrey capsules for ulcers, several months of use, develops liver damage, must stop all medications. His liver slowly recovers, partially. These cases were documented, published in medical journals, added to the evidence base. Not proof of widespread harm, not an epidemic, but clear indication that Comfrey could cause serious liver damage in some people under some circumstances. The question became, what level of risk is acceptable? How do we balance traditional use against potential harm? Regulatory agencies got involved in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, in other countries. These agencies are responsible for protecting public health, for ensuring that products sold are reasonably safe. They reviewed the evidence, the animal studies, the human case reports, the chemical analyses. They consulted experts, toxicologists, herbalists, physicians, representatives from various perspectives. The discussions were complex, contentious sometimes. Different stakeholders had different priorities. Herbalists emphasized traditional use, argued that Comfrey had been used for thousands of years, that millions of people had used it without obvious harm. They pointed out that most traditional use was external. That internal use was often short-term for acute conditions, not daily for months or years. They argued for labeling rather than banning. for education rather than prohibition, for allowing informed choice. Toxicologists emphasized the clear evidence of harm. The animal studies, the human cases, the known mechanism of liver damage, they argued that the risk was real, that some people would be harmed if internal use continued, that protection of public health required restriction. They pointed out that there were alternatives, other mucilaginous herbs without toxic alkaloids, marshmallow root, slippery elm bark. Why risk harm when safer alternatives existed? Physicians were divided. Some supported restriction, saw no reason to use a potentially toxic herb when safer options existed. Others were more sympathetic to traditional use, recognized that many remedies have risks, that medicine is always about balancing risks and benefits. They pointed out that even common medications, aspirin for instance, can cause harm, can cause bleeding, can damage the stomach. Yet we accept these risks because the benefits outweigh them. Was Comfrey different? Should it be held to a different standard? The regulatory decisions varied by country but followed similar patterns. For internal use, the conclusion was generally that the risks were too great. The liver toxicity was serious and safer alternatives were available. So internal use began to be restricted. Products for internal use were withdrawn from the market, or required warning labels, or were banned outright. In Germany, the BfArM, the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, restricted internal use. Limited duration, limited dose, required warnings. In Britain, the MHR, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, banned the sale of unlicensed Comfrey products for internal use. Licensed products could still be sold, but with strict labeling requirements, with clear warnings about liver toxicity, with limitations on dose and duration. In the United States, the FDA did not ban Comfrey outright, but issued strong advisories against internal use. Manufacturers were warned, products were recalled or reformulated. The message was clear: internal use was not recommended. This was a major shift, historically unprecedented. For 2,000 years, Comfrey had been taken internally, had been considered safe, had been standard treatment. Now, within a few decades, that practice was being abandoned, was being actively discouraged by health authorities. This was progress, in one sense, in safety, in protecting people from hidden harm, in applying scientific understanding to traditional practice. But it was also loss of tradition, loss of confidence in ancient wisdom, loss of that sense that the old ways knew best. External use, however, was found to be much safer. This was important. This preserved something of the tradition. When Comfrey is applied to intact skin, very little of the alkaloid is absorbed into the bloodstream. The skin is a barrier, not perfect, but good enough. The amounts that penetrate are minimal, usually insufficient to cause harm. The concentrations reaching the liver are very low, not enough to cause damage, except perhaps with very prolonged use over very large areas of skin. So external use remained approved, with some caveats, with some warnings. Not on broken skin, where absorption might be greater. Not for extended periods without interruption. Not during pregnancy or breastfeeding. Not for children, whose smaller bodies might be more vulnerable. But for short-term use on intact skin for injuries. External Comfrey was considered acceptable. The benefits appeared to outweigh the minimal risks. And research continued. Clinical trials were conducted, randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of modern medical evidence. These trials looked at topical Comfrey for various conditions: sprains, strains, osteoarthritis, back pain. The trials were designed carefully. Patients were randomly assigned to receive either Comfrey cream or a placebo cream. Neither patients nor evaluators knew who received which. Then outcomes were measured. Pain levels, functional improvement, range of motion, how quickly people recovered. The results were generally positive. Comfrey creams performed well, often better than placebo, sometimes as well as standard anti-inflammatory medications. For acute ankle sprains, studies showed faster pain relief with Comfrey cream than with placebo. Faster return to function. For knee osteoarthritis, improvements in pain and function. Patients could walk better, had less discomfort. Improved quality of life for acute back pain. Similar benefits, reduction in pain intensity. Improvement in mobility. These were not miraculous cures, not dramatic transformations, but meaningful improvements, real benefits. And importantly, the trials confirmed safety for external use. No serious adverse effects were reported. Some people had minor skin irritation, but this was uncommon. This was validation, scientific validation of traditional external use, the old knowledge meeting modern standards and being found worthy. The German Commission E issued a monograph for Comfrey. This is significant, worth explaining. Commission E was a regulatory body in Germany that evaluated herbal medicines, determined which ones had sufficient evidence to be approved. Germany takes herbal medicine seriously, integrates it into mainstream healthcare, has high standards but recognizes value. Commission E reviewed the evidence for Comfrey. The traditional use, the modern research, the safety data, and they issued a positive monograph for external use, approved Comfrey root specifically for external application for bruises, for pulled muscles and tendons, for sprains, the traditional uses, now officially recognized as valid. This was an important moment. Official medical recognition, not just folk remedy anymore, but legitimate medicine supported by evidence, of course, limited to external use. The monograph specifically warned against internal use due to liver toxicity, but still recognition, validation, the tradition upheld in modified form. Pharmaceutical companies develop standardized Comfrey products, creams and gels with specific concentrations of active compounds. These products were tested, regulated, quality controlled, a far cry from the poultices made in monastery gardens, but serving the same purpose, helping injuries heal, reducing pain and inflammation. Continuing the ancient tradition in modern form, these products are sold in Europe, particularly in Germany, where herbal medicine is well integrated into mainstream practice. They are prescription, only in some cases, over the counter with pharmacist advice in others, but available, used, trusted. People use them for sports injuries, for arthritis, for muscle strains, for the same kinds of problems that have always responded to Comfrey. And they work. The modern research confirms this, not perfectly, not for everyone, but often enough to be worthwhile. The modern research has revealed something else interesting about Comfrey, about how it works. It is not just allantoin, not just one compound. There are other active compounds, many other compounds, rosmarinic acid, for instance. This is a polyphenolic compound with anti-inflammatory properties, found in Comfrey and various other plants. It inhibits inflammatory pathways, reduces the production of inflammatory mediators. This contributes to pain relief and healing. Other polyphenols, flavonoids, tannins, mucilage compounds, all contributing in various ways. The healing effect comes from this complex mixture, not from any single compound, from the whole plant working together. This is something herbalists have always understood intuitively, that plants work holistically, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Modern research is beginning to appreciate this, to study whole plant extracts, rather than just isolated compounds. And Comfrey is part of this new understanding, this integration of old wisdom and new methods, recognizing that traditional use had value, that the whole plant extract may work better than any isolated compound, but also recognizing dangers, restricting unsafe uses, protecting people from harm. This is how knowledge should progress, taking the best of the old, adding the insights of the new, discarding what is harmful or ineffective. So where does Comfrey stand today? In a complex position, a nuanced position, restricted for internal use. The ancient practice abandoned due to safety concerns, 2,000 years of tradition set aside. This is both progress and loss, progress and safety. Loss of tradition, but valued for external use. Validated by research, supported by evidence. The tradition upheld in this modified form, used by herbalists who understand its properties and limitations, used in standardized pharmaceutical products, used by people seeking natural remedies for common injuries, still growing in gardens, still available, still useful, just understood differently, used more carefully with more awareness of risks and benefits. This is the modern Comfrey, different from the ancient, but connected to it, carrying the tradition forward in adapted form. The modern story of Comfrey is a story of change, of tradition meeting science, of old knowledge being examined with new tools. Some traditions were upheld. External use for injuries remains valid, useful, supported by evidence. Other traditions were abandoned. Internal use for bleeding, for ulcers, for various conditions. The risks now known to outweigh benefits. This is how knowledge progresses, how understanding deepens, how medicine improves. But something is lost in this process too, something beyond just the internal uses, the intimate knowledge of the plant. The confidence in using it, the sense of partnership with nature. In the past, every village had people who knew Comfrey, who grew it, who prepared it, who used it skillfully, who understood it not just as a collection of chemicals, but as a living plant, with its own nature, its own character. Today, most people have never seen Comfrey, don't know what it looks like, can't identify it, have never touched it. They might use a Comfrey cream from a pharmacy, might benefit from its effects, but have no relationship with the plant itself. This is loss of connection, loss of that immediate embodied knowledge that comes from growing and preparing medicines yourself. We have gained safety, standardization, scientific validation. These are real gains, important gains, but we have lost something too. Some connection to the plant world, some self-sufficiency, some sense of partnership with nature. The challenge, perhaps, is to find a balance, to retain what is valuable from both old and new, to use Comfrey safely with understanding of risks, but also to know the plant, to grow it, to relate to it, to maintain that connection, to respect both the chemistry and the living reality, both the alkaloids and the growing plant in the garden. This integration is possible, difficult perhaps, but possible. Let us rest here. In this modern moment, with all its complexities and contradictions, the laboratory bench beside the garden bed, the clinical trial alongside the ancient text, science and tradition in conversation, sometimes agreeing, sometimes conflicting, but both contributing to understanding. This is where Comfrey stands today, in this complex intersection, modern and ancient, scientific and traditional, safe and restricted, valued and cautioned against. All of these things at once, neither wholly vindicated nor wholly condemned, but understood more deeply, more completely than ever before. Segment 10, Closing Reflections, the memory of Comfrey. And so we come to the end of our long journey through the history of Comfrey root, from ancient Greece to modern laboratories, from monastery gardens to frontier homesteads, from apothecary shops to regulatory agencies. It has been a long story, longer than most plants can claim, richer, more layered. 2,000 years of human interaction with a single species, 2,000 years of observation, of use, of relationship. What can we say? Looking back over all these centuries, what does Comfrey's history teach us? Let us reflect on this slowly, without hurry. There is time yet before sleep claims you entirely. Perhaps Comfrey teaches us about the persistence of knowledge, how information is passed down through generations, from hand to hand, from master to student, from parent to child. Across vast spans of time, Greek physicians observing the plant's effects, writing them down, these writings copied and recopied through centuries. Medieval monks reading those ancient texts, adding their own observations, passing the knowledge forward. Renaissance herbalists compiling everything known, publishing in printed books that spread the knowledge wider than ever before. Colonists carrying that knowledge across oceans, planting Comfrey in new soil, teaching new generations in a new world. Each generation learning from the last, adding their own experience, their own understanding, then passing it forward. This is how human knowledge works, how it persists, how it grows. A relay race across centuries, each runner carrying the baton a little further. The thread might fray at times, might seem about to break. Dark ages come. Books are burned, knowledge is lost, but never entirely, never completely. Someone remembers, someone preserves, someone carries forward. And the knowledge survives, changes, adapts, but survives. Comfrey's thread can be traced clearly through time, from Dioscorides to Galen to medieval herbals, to Parkinson and Culpeper, to eclectic physicians, to modern researchers, the same plant, the same observations, fundamentally refined, expanded, corrected, but recognizably connected. This continuity is remarkable, precious. It shows what humans are capable of when we work together across generations, building on what came before, adding new insights, passing forward a richer understanding. The history also teaches us about the relationship between humans and plants, how deeply intertwined they are. We have used plants for food, for medicine, for material goods for thousands of years. Since before written history, and plants, in turn, have shaped us, our cultures, our practices, our very survival. Comfrey is one small thread in this vast tapestry, but it is a clear thread. We can trace it. We can see the pattern. The plant has remained essentially unchanged through all this time, still grows the same way, still produces the same compounds in its roots. But the human understanding of it has changed dramatically, from observation alone to chemical analysis, from theory to empirical testing. The plant is constant. Our understanding evolves, deepens, becomes more complete. This is the nature of knowledge. The object remains. Our perception of it develops. The story teaches us about the limitations of tradition as well. This is important. Perhaps the most important lesson. For 2,000 years, people used comfrey internally, believed it was safe, trusted it based on long experience, but it wasn't entirely safe. The pearlizidine alkaloids were there all along, causing harm in ways that weren't recognized, weren't connected to the cause. Tradition alone is not sufficient. Long use does not guarantee safety. Widespread practice does not prove effectiveness. These are hard lessons. They challenge our assumptions, our respect for ancient wisdom, our trust in what has always been done. But they are necessary lessons, essential lessons. Knowledge must be tested, questioned, examined critically, not rejected automatically, not dismissed because it is old, but examined, understood, verified, or corrected as evidence demands. Yet science alone is not sufficient either. This is equally important. The modern trials confirm what the ancients knew. Comfrey helps injuries heal, reduces pain and inflammation. The traditional use was not mere superstition, not placebo, not wishful thinking. There was something real there. Science validated this, explained the mechanisms, refined the applications. But the core observation was sound. We need both traditional knowledge and scientific validation, each informing the other, each contributing to understanding. Traditional knowledge provides observations accumulated over time. Patterns noticed, effects observed, starting points for investigation. Science provides tools for testing, for measuring, for understanding mechanisms, for separating real effects from coincidence and placebo. Together, they create deeper understanding than either could alone. Comfrey also teaches us about names, how names carry meaning and shape perception. Knitbone, bone set, bruisewort, symphytum. Each name tells a story, suggests a use, carries cultural memory. Language matters, the words we use to describe plants, to categorize them, to think about them. These words are not neutral. They carry history. They influence how we interact with the natural world. When you call a plant knitbone, you are making a claim about what it does. The name itself is a form of knowledge transmission. A child learning that name learns simultaneously the plant's identity and its use. The name and the knowledge are inseparable. This is elegant, efficient, beautiful in its way. Modern botanical names are more precise. Symphytum officinale identifies the exact species, eliminates confusion. But they are colder, more distant. They tell you taxonomy, but not use classification, but not relationship. Perhaps we need both kinds of names. Scientific names for precision, common names for memory and meaning, both serving their purposes, both valuable in their contexts. The history of Comfrey teaches us about change, how practices shift over time, how even the oldest traditions eventually transform, once essential, once universally known and used, now marginal, now restricted, now largely forgotten by most people. Nothing stays the same. Even the oldest traditions, even the most established practices. Everything changes eventually. This is not necessarily bad. It is simply the way of things, the nature of human culture, always in flux, always evolving. Sometimes change is loss. The abandonment of internal use represents loss of tradition, loss of a practice that sustained countless generations. Even if that practice was not entirely safe, even if modern alternatives are better, the loss is real. The break in continuity is real. Other times, change is improvement, external use being validated by research, standardized, made more reliable and safe. This is gain, this is progress. Building on tradition while adding new understanding. Change is complex, rarely purely good or purely bad, usually a mixture. Some things gained, some things lost. Our task is to be thoughtful about change, to preserve what is valuable, to improve what needs improvement, to adapt wisely, not to cling blindly to tradition, not to embrace novelty uncritically, but to discern, to choose carefully, to move forward with wisdom. I think sometimes about all the hands that have prepared Comfrey over the centuries. Thousands of hands, millions perhaps, across 2 millennia and 3 continents. Monks in quiet gardens, village-wise women at their hearths, apothecaries like myself in shops like this, homesteaders on the American frontier, farriers in their stables, modern herbalists in their clinics, all doing essentially the same thing, taking root, cleaning it, preparing it, applying it to injury. The same gesture, repeated across vast gulfs of time and space, across cultural differences, across changes in understanding. The fundamental action remains recognizable, remains connected. There is something moving about this continuity, this thread, connecting us to the past. When I prepare Comfrey now, I am doing what Dioscorides did, what medieval monks did, what countless others have done. I am part of that long chain, that transmission of knowledge, that continuity of practice. It is humbling to be part of something so much larger than myself, so much longer than my individual life. And it is comforting, in a way, to know that others have done this before me, that they found it worthwhile, that they passed it forward. The plant itself endures, still growing in gardens and wild places, unchanged essentially since ancient times, still sending up its tall stalks each spring, the same coarse, hairy leaves, the same purple flowers drooping in clusters, still producing that sticky, white mucilaginous substance in its roots. Patient, available, useful, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be used, waiting to be appreciated. There is a lesson in the plant's persistence. In its quiet endurance, human knowledge rises and falls. Civilizations come and go, empires flourish and collapse, but the plant remains growing according to its nature, producing its compounds, offering its gifts, indifferent to human drama, unaffected by our theories and debates, simply being what it is. What will happen to Comfrey in the future? I cannot say. None of us can see ahead clearly. Perhaps research will find new uses for it, new ways to prepare it safely, new applications we haven't imagined. Perhaps it will fade further into obscurity, remembered only by specialists, a footnote in the history of medicine, or perhaps in some future crisis when modern medicines are unavailable, it will be rediscovered, will be remembered, will be needed again. People will remember that the grandmothers knew about Comfrey, will search old books, will learn the old preparations, will plant it again, will use it again, will find that the old knowledge still works, still serves. This has happened before, knowledge forgotten, then remembered, practice abandoned, then revived. Nothing is ever completely lost. Not while the plant still grows, not while some memory remains. The knowledge is still there, you see, still accessible, written in old books, held in old memories, preserved in herbal schools, in traditional medicine communities, in pockets of practice that maintain continuity. It can be revived if needed, can be brought forward again. This is the resilience of traditional knowledge. It may go dormant, like Comfrey itself, in winter, but it rarely dies completely. For now, Comfrey exists in a quiet space, not forgotten, not quite mainstream, somewhere in between. Those who know it value it, those who don't often never encounter it. And that is fine. Not every plant needs to be famous. Not everything needs to be widely known. Some knowledge can be specialized, can be held by those who appreciate it, who use it responsibly, who pass it forward carefully. As I come to the end of this long telling, the candles have burned very low, almost to their ends. The wax has pooled, the flames gutter and flicker. The shop is deep in shadow now. The night is very deep, very quiet. The world outside has gone to sleep. Only we remain here, listening. I'm speaking. I hope this history has been of some interest to you, has perhaps given you new perspective, new appreciation for Comfrey, for plants, in general, for the long memory of human interaction with the natural world. Has perhaps sent you gently towards sleep, which was, after all, the purpose, to tell a long, slow story, to let your mind rest. Comfrey's story is old, layered, complex, full of contradictions, full of paradoxes, ancient and modern, trusted and restricted, validated and cautioned against. Simple and complex, but it is also, in its way, straightforward, a useful plant used by people trying to help themselves and others across centuries and continents. That is enough, really. That is a good legacy for any plant to have. A plant that has served, that has helped, that has been part of human life and human healing for 2,000 years, that has earned many names. Knitbone, boneset, brusort, symphytum. Each name a tribute, each name a recognition that has traveled far. From Mediterranean shores to northern Europe, across the Atlantic, around the world, that has adapted to changing understanding, to new contexts, to modern knowledge, but remained essentially itself. Sleep well, gentle listener. May your rest be deep and restorative. May your bones stay whole and strong. May your injuries, such as they are, heal cleanly and well. May you wake refreshed, renewed, ready for whatever the day brings. And if you ever encounter Comfrey growing somewhere, in a garden or by a roadside, in a forgotten corner or a cultivated bed, take a moment. Stop. Look at it closely. Really see it. Touch the rough, hairy leaves, if you wish. Notice the purple flowers. Observe the vigor of the plant. Remember its long story. Remember all the hands that have touched it, all the purposes it has served. Remember that it was there when Greece was young, when Rome was mighty, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, through the settling of America, through all the changes of human history, constant, patient, offering its gifts. Century after century, and then perhaps let it be growing quietly, doing what it has always done, being itself, making its compounds, flowering for the bees, enriching the soil, still useful, if needed, still knitbone, boneset, brusort, Comfrey, still itself. After all these centuries, the candles are going out now, one by one, the darkness deepens, but it is a gentle darkness, a welcoming darkness, the darkness of rest, of sleep, of peace. Let it come. Let yourself drift. Let the story settle in your mind like a soft blanket. Comfrey in ancient gardens, in monastery physic beds, in frontier dooryards, in modern herbalists' plots, growing. Enduring serving, remembered. The long thread of knowledge stretching back through time and forward, always forward, as long as someone remembers, as long as someone knows, as long as someone passes it on. Rest now, sleep. Dream perhaps of quiet gardens, of plants growing in ordered beds, of old knowledge carefully preserved. Dream of continuity, of connection, of the long memory of healing. Good night, dear listener. May Comfrey's ancient blessing of knitting and binding follow you into sleep. May what is broken be made whole. Good night.